Did you have an opportunity when the co-op was over? Did they want you to stay? Did you have an opportunity to keep working with them?
So I was a terrible employee. Let's be completely honest.
Said I'm running you this letter and letting you know that my brother, he go better, he done better. Oh, na, 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 na. I'm running you this letter and letting you know that my sister, he go better, he done better. Oh.
This is episode 8 of the Better Informed Immigrant podcast. We're actually going to be doing our second episode series of the African immigration stories. And today I brought one of my friends online. I actually met him quite recently. He's in the DMV area. Ayo, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
I think James introduced me to you at the table tennis.
At Kraken, yeah.
At Kraken, which was pretty cool. Like, I know you're from Ilorin. Where in the Ilorin area?
So I grew up in a couple of different areas in Ilorin, but there's a Tonke area, which is kind of like the downtown area. So I would say that's where I'm from.
Okay. My mother's family is from Ilorin in the Oro area, which I've only been when I was very young.
Okay.
So if you took me to Ilorin right now, I couldn't tell you how to get there or anything like that. But I know one of the matriarchs at the time was like the principal at the school. There was a school for blind girls. It was a girls-only school for the blind in that area, and she was the principal, so the family kind of lived in that area. I should try to connect with them and see if there's anything I could do from a charity perspective with that school, because the family had quite a bit of history with that school, and I don't really know the whole thing. So that's pretty cool. So that's one connection. You didn't know I was your neighbor.
Yeah. But it's funny. I meet people all the time that, well, they're not directly from Ilorin, but they have like a family member who's kind of from the area, things like that. So
I see.
Yeah,
so tell me, from Ilorin, when and how did you come to the US? Or did you go to any other countries in between?
No. So my dad came to the US first, like I think 2001.
Okay.
So he was here. And then a couple months later, kind of like the rest of us just all came. So he was working here. So, and then he brought the rest of us in. At the time, it was just me and my older brother.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think, funny enough, I think when we were coming here, well, me personally, I didn't think it was going to be forever. To be honest, I don't remember the story they told us, but I don't think it was like, oh, well, moving here. So, but for me, like, I think maybe like after a couple of years, I was like, yo, so we're not going back?
You thought it was a visit?
Yeah, that's when I realized like this is like I'm in that move shot. But so that was an interesting realization, because I mean at the time all my friends were out there. Like I also felt like there was a certain level of freedom that we had growing up. Like me and my brother were always outside, we were always playing in the neighborhood.
Yep.
Yeah, you didn't really like feel like anything could really happen. Here it's like, all of a sudden people are telling me like, don't let your kids go outside. It's like this is a different, like there was a different sense of community, I think. Especially like Tonke area, the area that I'm from, like everybody knows each other. Like it's like even as recently when I was there a couple of weeks ago, I was going out with my cousin and he was taking me everywhere, and literally everybody knew him everywhere. So it was like it's that kind of community where like if you people know you. Like also most people, like we have University of Ilorin there, so that's like I think one of the largest universities. It's a federal university, so it's like most people either go to that school or they work at that school or they're affiliated with the school somehow. So most people kind of know each other.
I see. So yeah, just to help me understand some context here, like how old were you when in 2001 when your father moved to the US?
So I was 6.
You were 6?
Yeah.
Okay, so you were
6 or 7.
Okay, so you're old enough to know, we're traveling, but you were not old enough to understand everything that's going on. So in your mindset, you were thinking, we're just going on vacation or we're traveling to someplace. We're going to be coming back in a few weeks or something.
Yeah.
And then it just kept on becoming longer and longer. So what's going on? Like, aren't you going back?
Yeah, I think by age like 10 or 11, I was like, I don't think we're going back.
And I understand what you mean about like the sense of community. And in some ways, it's kind of interesting, right? So when I was growing up, I actually grew up in Lagos, in the Egbeda area of Lagos, right? And, all the kids during the day, all the kids are outside. You're playing on the streets. If you're a male, you're probably playing soccer. The car is coming, you take the stone off the road so the car can pass. And then you're playing on the road. There is no like local park or anything like that. Like you said, like during the holidays, when I was growing up, what would happen during the holidays, like Christmas time specifically and New Year's, is all the kids would get together and we'll go to house in the neighborhood. So it doesn't matter if they had kids or they didn't have kids. They knew we were going to come at some point and you get there, you eat and drink at their house, and then you move on to the next house. So I imagine that's the same kind of community you're talking about. But yeah, you come over here and there's this mindset. I don't know why that is actually. But yeah, generally, you don't necessarily see kids playing on the street like we do.
Not anymore. When I first got here, you still saw it a bit. At least people would be in playgrounds, right?
Okay.
But nowadays, like you drive past playgrounds, it's empty. Like there's nobody. The kids are just at home on their iPads, on their iPhone. Like there's absolutely no form of like cardio happening anymore for these kids.
So did you guys move from Ilorin to the US, or did you move from Ilorin to like Lagos and then to the US? Like how did that work?
So we went to Lagos first. So we were in Lagos for a couple of months.
Okay.
Yeah, before we came to the US. Yeah.
And when you came to the US, where in the US did you arrive?
New York City. So we went straight to New York City. Yeah.
Yeah, but where was the family living at the time? So your dad already moved already. Where was he living? Was he also in New York? Or?
Yeah, he was in New York. He was in Brooklyn. Yeah, so we just went to go.
Oh, really? So New York, New York. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like New York City, yeah.
Oh, I think that explains why you didn't necessarily see people at the playground or anything like that. So I lived in Connecticut. You still see kids in the playground a little bit, right? Because we're kind of in the suburbs, but you're in the city proper, right? Yeah.
Yeah. We were in the city, yeah.
That's pretty interesting. So what did your dad do? What was his profession?
When we were in Nigeria, he used to teach at University of Ilorin. He was
okay.
Yeah, so when we got out here, he started working at a hospital. So he was like one of the department heads for a hospital in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Yeah, so he did a lot of like logistical stuff like that.
All right, so your experience must be pretty different, right? Because he came when you were 6 or 7. You came, is it a few months or a few years after?
Yeah, he lived in a year.
In a year. So you probably went through like the school system here. Because when I came back to the US, I only just went to community college and then the 4-year college, right? If you were probably 8, you probably went to elementary school here too, right?
Yeah, primary 2. Yeah, I went to elementary school here.
All right. So, and I know our system is different from the system here in the US. So did they move you back to kind of make you align with the system here? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, because here they do it by age. But in Ilorin, I was already like, I think primary 3 or something like that. I was already like, I've been in school for a few years.
Okay.
But here, like, also, I think because like they knew that we had come from overseas, they probably just assumed like they don't know what level of education you're at.
Yep.
So they just kind of like, okay, let's just put them here and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. One thing to note, I would say, is that obviously, especially in New York City, there are a lot of immigrants from different parts of the world. And a lot of them don't speak English, right?
That is true, yeah.
So it's normal for somebody to say, hey, you're an immigrant. I don't know anything about Nigeria or any place else. I'm just going to assume that you're the same as somebody else who doesn't speak English, put you in the same category. So tell me a little bit about that. You know, they obviously put you back to whatever the age class was. Did you have to take like any ESL classes, English as a second language classes, something like that?
Yeah, so I had to, but at the time, I didn't know what it was. So what used to happen was someone would come to the classroom and they would like call like me and like maybe like 1 or 2 other students. Okay. And then we'd have to go to like this library area and like we'd have to like read a book.
Okay.
Or something. But I don't know why I didn't think anything of it at the time. I didn't, because it was only like me and 2 other Mexican kids. But I didn't connect the dots until like later on, like I think when I was in high school or college, I was like, oh, that was ESL.
I didn't have no idea. Though. Why didn't they realize that you actually spoke English and based on how you were writing in class? This is where some people say like maybe it's element of racism. I don't think it's this. I think it's usually just you're so embedded into the routine, or if it's a foreigner, this is what we do. That you don't necessarily think to see whether or not, you know what, this person doesn't really meet the criteria or they're better than this, they need to do something else.
I agree. I think it's kind of the bureaucracy of the U.S. education system, right? Where it's like, there's really no nuance to it. They don't really care what level you individually are. They're just going to treat everybody with a similar, especially in New York. Because I think at the time, Michael Bloomberg was the mayor and he had this No Child Left Behind policy, which was basically like, we're going to pass you if you could do the bare minimum. Basically, that's what they meant. So it was like everybody was treated like a broad stroke. There was no like independent like evaluation of like the students' ability and things like that. Because I remember I used to go to the library area and I would just read the books like very easily. So I was not sure like what was going on or what. Because I've been reading since like maybe like 3 or 4 years old. So it wasn't really an issue. So, but later on I realized I was like, oh, I think I was in the ESL class. At the time I did not know who I was.
Okay. So I'm actually very interested in this story, not necessarily what we're talking about now. I want to move on to a different aspect. What was it like coming very young having to deal with kids your age, obviously you had an accent from their perspective, right? Everybody has an accent,
definitely.
but you had an accent from their perspective.
Yeah.
You know, you hear stories that people say, I don't think they use it anymore, like African booty scratcher and all this kind of stuff. Did you experience any teasing, I don't want to use the word bullying, but were there any social dynamics that came into play because of the way you spoke and the way you moved in that space because of the fact that you came from a different country?
Funny enough, not really. So I never really experienced any of the bullying and things like that. But I think it was because New York City being such a melting pot, there were a lot of kids that barely spoke English. Like, as far as the immigrants went, I think I was one of the ones who was easier to communicate with, right? So you have like Chinese kids, like barely spoke any English, like, you know, Hispanics. Also, New York has a large Haitian community. So a lot of people from Haiti. I think because I could speak with a lot of my peers, like I pretty much made friends right away.
Okay.
Also, at the time, like people used to play outside. So it was like basically if you were fast and you could play sports, like people liked you.
Okay.
So yeah, so that wasn't really a big leap for me to, you know, to start. But at the time, I definitely realized like my accent was probably very, very thick. But you know, you're not hearing your own accent. So I'm thinking I'm speaking just like everybody else, but I probably was not.
So your father came, you and your brother came in a few months after. Did your mom also come with you?
Yeah, I'm working with us as well. Yeah.
Now, in Nigeria, was your mom working or was she not working?
She was working. She used to teach at a secondary school in Ilorin.
In Ilorin?
Yeah. So, yeah, I remember I used to go to school with her sometimes. So
okay. And when the whole family moved over here, now you guys were in Brooklyn, New York. Did she also pick up a job or how did that work?
Yeah, but not right away. I think at the time, she went back to school. Like my dad put her back through like schooling and stuff like that. So she did a couple of different things before. She did a couple of years before she started working.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to kind of explore here. So number one is, you know, we're talking about the academic experience here in the US. And because the school system is dealing with kids from different parts of the world, that's number one. But also they're dealing with a lot of kids at the same time. So they kind of tend to come up with processes for how they deal with kids, which are not necessarily individualized to each kid, right? And sometimes the way people navigate that would be, if you have a parent that's well informed, they can be more involved in the process by going to the school to go have conversations with the administrators or teachers and make sure that those processes are applied in the right way to their kid, right? Rather than just the broad strokes that we talked about. I guess my first question to you, and this is from your recollection, do you recall whether or not your parents were involved with your school administrators? Obviously, there's the visit the teacher or whatever, once a semester or once a quarter, whatever that is. But apart from that, did you feel as if your parents were engaged with the process or did you just let the education do its thing and they take care of you when you were home?
I think it was a little bit half and half. So it was, I think like if you're doing pretty decent in school, your parents are pretty much hands-off. It's if you're struggling that they're going to be, you know, more involved, right? So I think because I had like the educational background from home already, like I was pretty much ahead of people in every like class I was in already. So like math, English, like the important subjects. Okay. So I didn't really have any problems with school. So my parents, like, they weren't too involved with it in terms of like, I mean, they'll look at your grades, but they weren't like coming to the school or talking to the teachers and things like that. Not really.
Yeah, like when I was in Nigeria, I don't recall, like, you know, I went to elementary and secondary school in Nigeria. My parents never showed up. So I was in boarding school. They would send me off to school and they were like, it's kind of like hands off. I said that when we had like, I forgot what it's called now, but used to have holidays in the middle of the semester where you go home for like a week and then come back. But my dad, especially, he just cared about, like you said, the report card at the end. Right. And if that's okay, then, and even if that's not okay, he will talk with you and see how we can improve the stuff. Maybe sometimes encourage you, sometimes chastise you, depending on what he felt was the right approach at the time. And then he kind of lets the things work. So that's a really good point that you were bringing up. All right. So you went to elementary school in New York. Did you also go to high school and middle school in New York as well?
Yeah. So high school, middle school, I went to in Brooklyn as well.
Oh, wow. City. For me, I've always lived in Connecticut, which is a lot slower pace compared to New York City. So New York for me is like a nice place to visit for a weekend. Actually, after a day, I'm tired of it. I don't want it anymore. But people that live there on a day-to-day basis, I think it's pretty interesting because it's like really fast-paced or could be fast-paced. There are so many options available. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You finished high school, you decided you wanted to go to college, or how did that college mindset kind of play in, and where did you go?
So as far as the college mindset, I don't really think it was a discussion. It was kind of just like, you're going to go to school. Like, I don't know. I never talked about it or asked the question. My parents never, like, the idea of me not going to college never even came up in our family, like, as far as like a option. So, I mean, who knows? Maybe if I even knew it was an option, but at the time was literally I went straight from high school, just applied to colleges. So I went to Northeastern University in Boston.
Okay. Oh, you went to Northeastern?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Boston is closer to my side of the stuff. So okay.
Yeah. It's like 2 hours from Connecticut. So,
and what did you study at Northeastern?
I did chemical engineering.
Chemical engineering. Now, it seems as if your dad was in the medical line or healthcare line, because you said he was a department head for one of the hospitals in New York. Your mom was in education. What made you decide to go engineering, number one? But what also made you decide to go chemical engineering, number two, right? Let's say every Nigeria, it's lawyer, doctor, engineering, and there's one more thing. I forgot what it is.
Yeah, I think the last one is failure to family, something like that. Something of that nature, I think. So my older brother, he went to Northeastern University also.
Okay.
And he did chemical engineering also. So it was like, so at the time, I knew I didn't really want to be a medical doctor. To be honest, I think I really wanted to be a physicist. But one time my mom was just like, is there money in it? So then I was like, let me try to do a happy medium and let's just do engineering. So that way I get some of the physics with like a title where there's a job attached to it, right? Because I mean, physicists, it's like you either go into research or, you teach, or both, right? You teach at a school, professor, and you do research. You do both.
Actually, so yeah, but I think that's not necessarily true in my opinion, because actually at my job now, I work with quite a bit of physicists. So the things with physicists in general specifically is a lot of them do a lot of the advanced degrees too, right? So they do the masters, they get the PhD. And because of the breadth of knowledge that they have, people are so happy to hire them, even as engineers, right? Because they understand the physical phenomena. Applying the engineering principles is easy for them because they already understand like how these things work.
I agree.
So there's that space that they can go into as well. So
I definitely agree. I think the difference is kind of the level of schooling for like the return on investment. So for example, you become very, very specialized, but like you end up kind of doing similar work with someone maybe who has a bachelor's and maybe 5, 6, 7 years experience. So it's a level of schooling for the return on investment. But by the time I wanted to do physics, because I wanted to do research actually. Okay. So I used to watch a lot of these science shows on TV. They would have like physicists on the shows. Sometimes it would be like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Michio Kaku, this like Japanese theoretical physicist. So at the time I was just very intrigued by that kind of stuff. So I wanted to kind of go in that direction. But you know what? I'm not complaining that I did not.
I'm thinking about it though. Like one of the things that we're going to get to is what you do now and how you do it now, specifically remote work. And I don't know that you could do remote work as a physicist. I don't know.
Actually, you know what? I'm not so sure.
I mean, if you were doing research, for example, you may have flexibility in setting up hours or anything like that. But so I think you're going to have to be on site. I don't know. That's a really good question. All right. Your mom asked the question, is there money in it? You weren't sure about the answer. So you said, hey, let's change direction. My older brother is doing chemical engineering anyway. Was it in school when you joined Northeastern, or had he finished?
He was still in school as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why chemical?
Yeah. So at the time, I was also kind of considering medical school too.
Okay.
So of kind of the engineering majors, the classes I would take in chemical engineering were the closest to the prerequisites for like where I could easily enter like a med program.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's another reason why I chose chemical engineering.
Okay.
I would take organic chemistry. I would take all these med school classes as well. So I wouldn't have to take a bunch of different classes if I decided to go to medical school.
Okay. So that's actually quite interesting, right? Because a moment ago, you said you knew you didn't want to become a medical doctor. But then you're then saying, hey, I was considering
that. Yeah,
what's
that was
going on there.
One of my favorite shows growing up was House.
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess I like medicine when it's practiced like that, but that's very like, breaking the law, doing like, that's not really,
That's not real medicine. That is
it's not real medicine. It's entertainment, yeah. So I guess when I realized that practicing wouldn't be like that at all, I was like, it sounds kind of boring now, doesn't it? So, and I think I read some stat that was like majority of people become like a clinical physician or whatever. Majority of people you see are going to be coming in with like a common cold or like runny nose. I was like, I don't really want to be doing that for hours at a time of my day, So I was like, yeah, I think I'll enter into something more exciting.
Okay. All right. So actually, one of my friends and the person we did the first episode of this series with is actually a medical doctor. He's just finished all his programs. I'm going to use the wrong terms exactly for this because he's told me like 3 or 4 times and for some reason it doesn't stick. But he's just finished all his stuff, so he's actually fully practicing now. So I could definitely ask him about whether or not the experience is anything close to House MD.
I doubt it. I completely doubt it. But,
I'll tell you, do you have a walking stick and do you get limp as you're seeing patients? Okay, so you finished at Northeastern. What was the next step for you?
So at the time of Northeastern, I had done like 3 internships. They were like, so Northeastern has this program called co-op program where they allow you to do like, so you take 6 months of the year. And instead of being in classes, you're doing like a paid internship for 6 months.
Okay.
So I had done 3 paid internships at Northeastern.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then, yeah. So the last one I did.
Same company or different companies?
3 different companies. So the last one I did, when I graduated, I ended up working with them part-time, like when I was back in classes. And then when I graduated, I kept working with them. So I worked with them, this was 2018, I believe. Like the second half of 2017, and then the entirety of 2018, I was working with that same company.
I have a few questions about this, right? Because this is a really good teaching moment. Like when I went to UConn, when I was in university, I didn't know or care about internships, right? In retrospect, I should have done more. I didn't care about any of those things. Like it didn't matter. It was my final year that I said, oh, let me go find an internship because I thought it was going to help me get a job. So I ended up doing an internship with a company in Kansas City, Missouri. They actually flew me out. It was a fantastic experience. They offered me a job at the very end. They gave us some time to accept the offer or whatnot. I didn't know any better, right? Like nobody ever spoke to me about internships or things like that. And there were resources on the university, but I never really took advantage of it, right? It's like, I went to school kind of like similar to what you were saying. You kind of went to school because it was the thing that was expected to do. It wasn't as if you were strategic in that choice. So there were certain things that I didn't know about the experience that I should have probably learned. But my point I was trying to make is that they offered me a job. They told me the deadline of stuff. I took the job offer and I just ignored the job offer. I did not do anything with it. I go back to the university, I finish. I'm sure the deadline has already passed. And even when I finished university, it was when I was done that I was thinking, okay, what do I need to do for jobs? You know what I'm trying to say? And that opportunity I had is already gone because the deadline had already passed because I didn't take advantage of it. Now, I graduated in December 2007. What was going on or what was happening at that time was a recession. So as I was applying to jobs and things like that, all of the jobs I was applying to were getting canceled because of the recession, right? And if I had known any better, if anybody had sat me down to say, hey, Kwara, this is what you do, or this is how this thing works, I would have taken that offer that I had. Even if I'm exploring other opportunities, taking that one, and if I decided I didn't want to do it, I would have done something else, right? Rather than finding myself in a situation where I was essentially at home for about 8 months because I couldn't get a job. Again, because the recession was going on, everybody was tightening or closing out their hiring. So I thought it was pretty interesting that you did 3 co-ops. I think that co-ops, internships, fantastic. I think you should do them early. I think you should do them often. I think it helps because, especially as an immigrant, you don't know what it means to have a professional job. Your parents may not necessarily be in the same line or industry that you are going into. And that's the only way you can get exposure into it outside of what's in your classroom. Because the classroom is going to teach you a bunch of basic stuff, but it doesn't really teach you how to become a professional, right? So I think that was fantastic. So a couple of questions for you there. Number one is, I'm sure that there were probably other kids in the university who didn't necessarily take advantage of this co-op program as well as you did. Like, what encouraged you to take advantage of that program as often as you did?
And so for Northeastern, co-op is like a big selling point of the school.
Okay. So
like that's, I think it's them and Drexel University. Those are the 2 schools where co-op is very, very big for the schools, because the schools have, it allows them to build relationships with people in the industry. So that way they kind of like the program as well. And essentially, from an economic standpoint, what co-op is cheap labor for the companies, right? Because they get students who at times can probably give you the same production as some professional workers for a lot cheaper price, right? Under the claim of like education, them kind of getting used to work environment, things like that. So it's a win for all 3 people. It's a win for the school, it's a win for the business, and it's a win for the student that's getting the experience. So at Northeastern, they're always pushing you. Like we have classes that's literally just for co-op. They help you build your resume, they help you apply to jobs, and then we have advisors who are the ones who sending out the resume. So like if you're not taking advantage of co-op at Northeastern, you have to go out of your way to not take advantage of it, because you have to take the class regardless. So you just have to say, I don't want to do it.
That's awesome. That is pretty cool, right? Because I don't recall having a class like that at UConn where they helped me build a resume or anything like that. I had to go figure that out on my own. We had a career center on campus, actually, and I'm sure they provide those resources there. But again, I didn't know any better, right? Nobody told me that kind of stuff. I probably had people in my life that could have told me, but I didn't know to ask the question, right? So it was when I was done and I had fully graduated and I was sitting at home, like what to do next was when I was kind of figuring out some of these things that we're talking about here. So that's pretty cool that they actually have a structured class where they actually help you guys build this stuff up. And that makes you even more desirable when you guys graduate, because by the time you graduate, you've had a year of experience, right? So when you're in that interview with somebody else, like me, for example, who just graduated from college, has zero experience or one internship, it doesn't necessarily hit the same. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. When I graduated, I actually had like 2 years of work experience.
Wow.
Yeah. So I worked 3 different companies, 6 months each. And then the last company, I ended up working with them for almost a year. So I had about 2 years of work experience. And I knew how to build a resume. I knew how to go to an interview. I knew, like, there were certain things I just knew how to do. So like when I was entering the work environment, I guess confident and calm, because I just knew that I could interview, I could build my resume, I could do things like that. So it was definitely a good experience. But I also know people who did no co-op. I had a friend who in school, he didn't do any co-op. He graduated with an electrical engineering degree in like 2.5, 3 years. Like no co-op. He just was in classes the entire time.
Yeah, rushed through the thing.
Yeah. So he just did, I think, 2.5, 3 years, and he graduated, and that was it. Yep. He didn't have any interest in co-op. I actually think he ended up going back to Ghana, actually. So I don't think he ended up working in the US. But that was kind of his. So I mean, everyone kind of does different things depending on your schedule, whether you value the time. Some people want to finish school as quickly as possible, or you value the experience, or gaining experiences and things like that. So.
And I think that goes back to being strategic a little bit. If you understand the options, you can decide, hey, I am going to take advantage of this, or I'm going to do something different, and this is why. But if you don't understand the options, then you may not necessarily take advantage of opportunities that you would have wanted to take advantage of. This question about the co-op and the internships that Northeastern was helping the students with and pushing them to go do, did that also apply to international students, or was it just for people that were like citizens? You know what I'm trying to say? People that were here as part of permanent residents kind of thing?
No, it applied to international students as well.
Okay.
So they were also on co-ops. Like I had friends who were international students who were able to get co-ops, and even some of them were able to get sponsorships afterwards graduating. After graduating, because they built those relationships with those companies. So they were able to stay for longer, go back to school. Like it opened up a lot of different opportunities for them. Yeah. So Northeastern has a lot of international students. So they find a way to keep them, I guess, in the country for longer. I think also a lot of times the ones who do stay longer, they end up going back to school, and it ends up being Northeastern anyway. So the school got kind of to be able to double dip off of students that they were able to get sponsorships and get to stay in the country longer. So.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, right? Because not everybody's situation is the same. But some people come here, they go to school, and their hope and their goal is to actually stay here permanently. But they don't necessarily know how to go about doing that, right? And this kind of gives an avenue, right? If you have an opportunity to do an internship or a co-op, definitely take advantage of it if you're an international student, because you build that relationship with the company. If you're a good worker and you present your best foot forward, that, like you said, could lead to sponsorship, where they sponsor you for a work visa, and you just continue that there. And probably what was happening with what you're saying about people going back to school is that sometimes maybe the sponsorship didn't necessarily work out, or something happened. All right. So you go back into your status as a student again. So you go back to a school, but that school is also trying to help you with industry. So you're bouncing back and forth for a little while until until it works out, and then you are settled here, versus just graduating without any of these things and then trying to apply in the regular workplace. It's a little more difficult, right? Because why should a company take the time and energy to sponsor you when they could have hired anybody else who doesn't need that sponsorship, right? So that's a little bit interesting then. I want to go backwards because I should have asked you this question. But before the co-op, have you done any job before that? Did you have any jobs when you were growing up? Like when I mean jobs, I mean professional jobs where you actually got paid.
No. That was my first co-op was like my first real job.
Right. So you did 3 co-ops. You graduated. You went to go work for the third company that you were doing a co-op with. What were you doing?
So at the time, they were working on injectables for like bone grafts and like bone molding. So at the time, it was. I think the company had a bunch of patents. Like the guy I worked with, I think he's probably the smartest person I've ever worked with. I don't know how many degrees he had, PhDs, and he was like, his name was on a lot of the patents for like these bone injectables, right? So a lot of athletes use it when they have like knee surgery or any like kind of surgeries, like their lower extremities, like anything bone related. They would use these injections to kind of strengthen the area and things like that. Yeah, so that's what the company worked on at the time. They had a bunch of patents for that, and they were based in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was it a small company or was it?
No, it was a big company. They had a small outfit in Cambridge, but their bigger base was located, I think, in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay.
Yeah, they were a very big company.
And what were you doing for them?
So I was doing a lot of the data analysis for the research. Okay. So at the time, they had me build like this analyzer tool in MATLAB that would basically read in spectroscopic data and then do a bunch of complicated math that my coworker had to walk me through. But it was able to kind of give you like a more accurate analysis of like the percent composition and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I spent a couple months on that project building that. And then there were other months where they were doing research and I was just analyzing the data. That's pretty much what I did for 18 months or so with them. Yeah.
18 months. Okay. So a couple of questions here. So yes, you've done the co-ops beforehand, right? So I want to talk about your first co-op. That's the first one. But I also want to talk about your first job graduating, right? The question I want to ask you is, did you know what it meant to be a professional? It looks as if Northeastern was preparing you guys anyway, right? They were helping you guys with the resume. They were probably telling you about other things like how to dress, how to do some other things like that. And I'm sure they tried to help the students. But, I was also a student too. Like there was a time where you can tell me this stuff, but I don't really understand the significance.
Yeah.
Right. So tell me about the first co-op experience. How did you learn what it means to be a professional? That's the first one. And then tell me about like between then and then your first job, your first professional job. What was that growth areas where you were still working on as a professional?
Okay. So my first co-op was probably the most impactful co-op I've had.
Okay.
I didn't want to say important because I think my third co-op was the most important, but my first one was the most impactful. The reason is because it was the first time I had to dress up for work. Like I was wearing a dress shirt, khaki pants, sometimes a tie, things like that. Mm-hmm. So I was commuting to work, 5 days a week. It's funny, talking to a lot of my friends, they had a very similar experience where your first job is like your co-op and you go in and you realize that you don't want to do this forever. And what I mean by that is, because I remember when I first started working, it was like, okay, this is a new experience, this is cool. But then when I met people who had been working for like 10, 15 years, even 8 years. And I would think like, man, this is what you do every day? Like this, like, you know what I'm saying? Like at some point, I think you kind of get stuck where it's like, they're kind of just in the motion, So I had one coworker that showed me how to really use Excel. Like at that point, I had only used Excel in school, things like that. Mm-hmm. But this was the first time I was like making pivot tables and like, I didn't even know Excel could do all this. This is why Microsoft makes so much money. This is interesting. And he was like very much like coming to work. And I remember because I used to sit behind him and there would be times where like I didn't really have anything to work on. And I would look behind me and I would be wondering, what is he working on? Like, some people who just come to work and just know how to look busy. I felt like he was just one of those people. So for me, like that job made me realize, I definitely don't want like a regular 9 to 5. I don't want to sit in like a cubicle, none of that stuff, essentially. Because I was like, it wasn't going to be feasible for me. Mm-hmm. So I think it was definitely my most impactful co-op.
Yeah, that is so funny because when you were talking about this, made me remember that internship I did. If you're going to make mistakes, it's good to make it during those times, right? Because at that time, you're not considered a professional yet, right? And you will make mistakes, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody's perfect. You're going to make mistakes because you don't know any better. But similar thing. Yeah. So one of my bad habits is I cannot sit still, right? I'm one of those people, I cannot sit still. Bad habit. I don't encourage anybody to be like me on that area. But when I was with this company in Kansas City, Missouri, basically what was happening is, it's like a healthcare IT company. And this company in retrospect, this company was fantastic. I just didn't realize that at the time. But they brought us in, they treated us very well. They hosted us in one of the college dormitories nearby. And they did some really nice things to help us out. But I was put in their department. It was kind of like a support department. So basically when the people that do the tickets and stuff like that, kind of like if you call help desk, right? And then they would then process the tickets and then it goes to us. We're considered like the engineering department where we are addressing these tickets. And because I was an intern, they gave me some training, so I was useful. But what I could do was limited, right? I didn't have the full breadth of training like somebody else who was a professional because they spent quite a bit of time training this stuff. So I would come into work and I would just be looking at this. I forgot what it's called now, but it's basically like some kind of system where you're looking at all the tickets that are available, right? And I'm looking at them and they get filtered to different departments depending on what the ticket's all about. And anything I can do, I'll just be grabbing it so quickly. But there were times where there was nothing there that I could do or there was nothing there at all, right? So I didn't know what to do. So sometimes I would spend time browsing the internet, which I probably shouldn't have been doing. It's not a good look. The other thing too is that I looked around me and there was this woman at the time who used to play music on Yahoo Music. And before I didn't used to do that, but because she was doing it and she was a full-time employee, I thought, oh yeah, we could do that here. So I started doing the same thing too. This is my perspective. I don't know if it's true, but I don't necessarily think people appreciated her doing that, by the way. Right. I don't think they thought she was but I didn't know any better. So I just started copying, right? So there were certain things that people started giving me side eye, like, hey, you may not want to do. They didn't tell you. I love Americans in the sense that they will not talk to you directly about certain things. Your boss will, but your colleagues may not necessarily do that, right? But they will talk about you at the water cooler kind of thing. Yeah. I learned some bad habits there. I also learned some good habits there about like how to do things. And that was one of the things I was thinking about in the sense of what you were talking about is how to look busy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Being a professional is two things. There are times where you're going to be extremely busy and you have to like put your nose to the grindstone and just get this thing done because there's so much work, it cannot stop. But there are also going to be times where there is very little work going on, right? And you kind of need to say, hey, we have to get all those things done on time. So you have to be motivated to get it done on time to support whatever it is that needs to get done. But at the same time, you don't want to look like you're expendable. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
you're expendable.
Exactly.
Right? So you kind of figure, it's kind of like, how do you, for lack of a better word, manage the perspective such that, you are providing value to the team, which you are doing, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you are not necessarily presenting a scenario where somebody might say, you know what, we don't really need this person here. We should let him or her go. So that's a really good point.
And that's what I kind of realized about, I think U.S. work culture is that there's such a stigma about seeming unproductive at work that I think a lot of the work sometimes is performative. So like European cultures, they have this, because I work with companies who have like maybe European offices where it's like some of the employees, they'll go for lunch and then they just won't come back to the office for the day. It's like that kind of culture where if there's no work, it's okay, right? Whereas America, there's this such a stigma around being unproductive that people will just sit there for 4 hours, maybe be just scrolling through Excel, right? It's completely unproductive, but they look like they're working, right? Because I remember at the time I started looking up statistics and stuff, and I saw something that said like the average U.S. worker only works for like maybe 4 hours out of the day, right? The rest of the day is just filling in the time, right? But the 8-hour workday is locked in. The 5-day work week is locked in.
Yep.
As the actual productivity of the work is maybe really 20 hours, right, for the week. That's kind of one of the interesting things about the first time I started working. I realized that you're just not going to have 8 hours of work a day sometimes, right? And then some days you might have 10 hours of work. So it depends, but it's not consistently 8 hours every day. Like, that's what I realized about the work week. It's not that linear, I guess, or uniform.
Yes. And that's a really good point. So I'm not familiar with some of the statistics that you just shared. I have to go and look into that because one of the goals of this podcast is kind of use this as a tool to educate fellow African immigrants. And these are some of the topics I think people should be aware of that I didn't even think about before. Like, how do you navigate these circumstances, right? Because you kind of need to look at basically what is the culture of your workplace. Some places are open and transparent enough where you can actually say, you know what, I don't have things to do and basically go do something else, right? And some places are like, even if you don't have anything to do, you have to pretend. That's what we're supposed to do. You know what I mean? That's the work culture there. And if you don't know, right, they wouldn't say, hey, the last 6 times that we had a jam and we need somebody to help bail us out, this guy bailed us out. What they will say is, oh, he's not working. He's watching YouTube. He's watching videos. Not realizing the fact that when work was actually available to be done, he was there and present and working it. So you kind of have to maneuver those situations. So you worked at this company for about 18 months. I said 18 years. 18 months. And then what did you decide to do next?
So then I had my second co-op, which if my first co-op was my most impactful, I think my second co-op was, I have a bit of deeper regrets about that one, and to be quite honest. So at the time I was working for a startup company in Boston. They did advertising campaigns. But at the time, I think we were like 40 employees. We were like in one office. It was like an open concept. Like the CEO was like, his desk was right there. Like it was a startup company. At the time, I didn't even really understand the technology that the company I was working at. Like slowly I started to realize like how big the idea was and things like that. It was like email advertising. They did a lot of work with MailChimp.
Okay.
So it worked like that. And so basically the software was out, the technology was out, and now they were kind of trying to sell it to different businesses.
Okay.
So at that company, the culture was completely different to my first company. It was like people were playing FIFA during work hours. It was like on Fridays, like they would like hand out beers. I don't know if I was 21 at the time, but I was just there. Like everyone was young. It was a completely different work culture. There was no dress code. Like I was coming into work in shorts. Like it was that kind of company. And they have like free snacks in the kitchen, all this stuff. So it was a completely different work environment, but it was more difficult because it was more technical. Like because there weren't that many employees, your work had to be accurate, right? So because a lot of the data that they're getting is actively relevant to the startup. So like I actually felt like I was basically an important employee. Like just being an intern wasn't really like I just had the title, but the work I was doing was very, very impactful.
Mm-hmm. I want to kind of clarify something. I think I got lost in the shuffle a little bit. So the first internship, you're talking about it being impactful, but that is not the bone injectables, right? The first co-op, I should say, not the internship. The first co-op, was that bone injectables?
No, that was my last one.
That was your last one. So the first co-op, what were you doing?
I was doing renewable energy. So I was looking at renewable energy design. So designs for like renewable energy systems.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a company that was a government company. It was partnered with the government, right? So essentially people would have renewable energy ideas and then they would decide how to go about funding it and things like that. So I would be looking at the designs to determine the viability.
Okay. And when you say looking at the designs, you're looking at it from like what perspective? Because your background is chemical engineering. Right. So I'm kind of trying to figure out, like, obviously you can apply engineering principles, but your specialty was chemicals. So when you talk about this renewable energy company, what are the aspects that you're looking at it from?
So I'm looking at the technical design. So like
technical design,
Yeah, from the equipment to a little bit of cost analysis, but that was pretty much like the finance people handling that. But majority of what I was looking at was from a technical perspective. Was this feasible? Could this power the house or whatever commercial entity they were trying to power and things like that?
Okay. So you go from there, you go back to school for a period of time, and then you go and do your second internship, right?
Yeah.
Which is with the startup company where startup culture is different, right? It is different. You work hard, you play hard. That's kind of how it is.
It was completely different. Everyone was like fresh out of school, and I was in school, so how young everybody was that was working there. So it was very interesting experience. The company actually ended up, I think maybe last year or 2 years ago, ended up IPOing for like $1 billion or something like that.
Oh, nice.
I knew the company was always going to be successful too. But that's why I say it was one of my biggest regrets, because I felt like I could have just rolled it out. I could have just, stayed there forever, to be quite honest. But, things
out during the IPO, cash out.
Yeah, I should, because I was watching a video of the IPO in New York, and they had like employees in the crowd, and I was just like, oh, I used to work with him. I was just like, oh man, that could have been me. I could have been.
I guess let me ask you the obvious question here. So, you went there as a co-op, right? So that's one thing. But did you have an opportunity when the co-op was over? Did they want you to stay? Did you have an opportunity to keep working with them?
Well, so I was a terrible employee. Let's be completely honest. If I wasn't, I would have stayed. But I was a terrible employee.
Why would you say that?
I think it was just when you're in school, I think sometimes you lose like the broader picture. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is said to the time that you kind of waste in school. What I mean by that is you just focused on classes. So anything that's not classes, you might not exactly put your entire energy into, because you're preached like college, like grades. Yep, so anything outside of that is very easy to kind of just like, I'll do this later, or, I'll take care of this later. But
wait, were you taking classes at the same time when you were doing this co-op?
No. But I was in school, so in my head I was just like, I'll be here for 6 months, and I'll just go back to class. You
were just going through the motions, kind of. Then
I was going through the motions.
You didn't fully understand the value, right? To you, it was just a roadblock that you do so that you could go back to school, finish your degree, and then go do something else.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that for all my co-ops, I didn't realize the value until I graduated. Okay. At the time, I was just doing it because I thought I had to do it.
Yep.
So even now, like I was saying about the company that ended up being very, very successful, the value of that would have been like, I could have stayed with the company if I was a more diligent worker. I think after my first co-op, the second one, I was just like, let's just get through this, right?
Yep.
And I think co-op kind of spoiled us a little bit too, because what it showed us was that if you were somewhere and you didn't like it, you could leave after 6 months. It kind of just set up this mentality that like, if I don't like it, I'm just going to go anyway.
Mm-hmm. You go in with the mentality you're only there for 3 to 6 months.
For 6 months, exactly.
And because you don't fully understand the value, it goes back to what we were talking about before, right? Everybody has a different situation. Like, hopefully my kids would be better informed because I would tell them certain things that I didn't have the information when I was at their age. But like you said, we're just going through the motions to go through the motions. We don't really understand the value of doing this thing. It's kind of teaching somebody personal finance. Like, okay, why am I doing this? I don't understand. Until you start paying your own bills and you start making your own money, then you begin to understand the value.
Exactly.
So I see your points there. And I appreciate the honesty of saying I was a terrible employee.
Yeah, Yeah, I was a very terrible employee at the time.
Okay.
So, but I think I learned how to not be an employee from that. From that job, yeah, because it was the first time I left somewhere and I felt like they were waiting for me to leave. Like it felt like it was like there was no party, there was no like pizza party, no nothing. It was just like, yeah. I came on my last day, I dropped off my laptop and I just walked out there. That was it.
Oh my Lord!
So that's what that felt like. But.
Okay. So you go from there. You go back to school again for 6 months or so, and then you go for your last internship.
Yeah, that's correct.
Was that a better experience than the second one?
Yeah. I think that was my best experience in the three. It was better because at the time I had already gained the experience from the first two. So I knew the things I liked about work. I knew the things I didn't like about work. And I kind of knew when I get my best work done. So that was a very productive co-op, which is why they asked me to continue on after the 6 months. And I ended up staying with them for the 18 months. So at that point, I learned different aspects of corporate culture. Also, my first two co-ops, I wasn't very, like, I'm not a big small talk person. So I would come into work and I wasn't really talking to anyone. Plus, Africans, plus New York, you have a little bit of a resting angry face. So you just did you're not very approachable. I think by my third co-op, I was more approachable. Even if I didn't want to do small talk, I could pretend. So my networking skills had grown a lot better by that time. So I had learned more things from school also. The work was easier. Plus, I was at the time, I think I learned MATLAB my freshman year of college. And this was the first time I had used, you use knowledge, but in my co-op, this is the first time I used a skill that I learned from school. It was very impactful. So I started to realize the kind of implications of the things I was learning in school. That's why that co-op was my most important co-op. Yeah.
Fantastic. I like that story for a couple of reasons. Number one is saying, hey, you learned from the experience, right? So the first one was good. The second one was terrible, right? But the third one was even better because you began to learn from your experiences and your mistakes and your successes and said, okay, this is what we should do the next time around. So that's absolutely fantastic. The other thing too is we're talking about things we learn in school and how they apply, right? So in engineering, and I'm an engineer as well, so I can use that as an example. You learn all these different skills, and then you start working in the industry and you realize maybe you're only going to use 5% of those skills that you learned. But there's going to come a time where you need to pull tools from that toolbox, right? Later on in the future. So that was kind of interesting when you talk about the MATLAB. You learned it in freshman year, you didn't really use it anymore. And then you were at this point just we have to go. Let me go pull up that book and open it up again and see how to do this. So that was interesting. And then, you talk about corporate culture, which I think is fantastic. At some point in time, maybe I'll have to do an episode on corporate culture in the US and compare that to the corporate culture in other places. Because I think that's also important, right? One of the things is not just what you know as far as your skills are concerned, your work skills are concerned. It's also how do you interact with people in this particular corporate environment. And that's kind of really important. All right. So you go to this co-op, you started, you worked for them part-time. You joined full-time, you stayed with them for 18 months, and then what happened?
And then after that, so I ended up leaving the co-op after 18 months. So at the time, they were going through a lot of corporate reshuffle, I guess.
Okay.
So they were going to move offices. So there was a lot of kind of uncertainty about the future of the office, let alone the future of my role in the office. Okay. So immediately I started looking for other jobs. Once I hit uncertainty, I was like, I need to be able to pay my bills.
Okay.
So I ended up getting another job 3 months later.
Wait. You left the job without having another job lined up?
Yeah, because at the time I was still young enough where I could go back home. So I went back home. I went back to New York for 3 months.
Okay. Oh my Lord.
Yeah, so
somebody should have told you don't leave a job without having the other job lined up.
At the time, I wanted to leave before they told me to leave because I had a feeling that the whole office was going to pack up. So I didn't want to come in one day and it's hey guys, we're shipping the jobs to Indiana. You know what I'm saying? Or you have to move to Indiana. So I was just let me beat them to it. So I was let me just get out of there.
Well, I see what you're saying. I think what I'm saying is slightly different in the sense of saying you can still make the decision that you are going to leave. Right? You can make the decision that you are going to leave. You know you're going to leave, but you don't actually leave until you have the other job lined up. In the sense that, you're just going to, for lack of a better word, this is not the right time to use, but you're going to milk the time. Obviously, provide value, right? But milk the time till you get another job, and then you say, "Thank you guys very much. This is my 2 weeks notice or whatever notice," and then you just go to the next job.
Yeah, no, the main reason I left early was because the bills. I was like, I just don't want to pay bills for right now. Let's just get out here. So it was like, if I didn't have any bills, I would have stayed in the job for longer. But I was just like, let me just let's
like
just
I want to live anyway, and I can cut all these expenses by going home. I'll just take a 3 month vacation.
So in order to cut my expenses, I also cut my source of income. So that was
oh my lord. Okay.
So I ended up going back home to New York for 3 months. I was at home from like September to December, three and a half months or so. And then January, I ended up going back to Boston for a new job. So I went back to Boston. This is when I started working. Well, I guess I've always been doing the engineering work. This was my first job where I didn't have any affiliations with like while I was in school. So it was a brand new environment, and it was a pretty large company at the time. I was working for Pfizer.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was working for Pfizer in Massachusetts, and that was an interesting experience too, because a lot of Pfizer's kind of corporate culture is very old and kind of like set in stone and built in. Mm-hmm. Which makes sense, right? Any field that's kind of FDA regulated, they're not going to be making a lot of changes to anything, like to people, equipment, ideas, nothing. Like they're not changing anything. The government has gave them a check mark. They're not even going to, like they're not even going to like try to have any sort of innovation.
Okay.
But that was a good experience because it was the first time where like the degree of separation from what I was doing to market was very small. Like I knew how much like the products we were making, like I knew how much like they were worth. I knew like, so for example, we might have worked for like, I was working in the manufacturing department.
Okay.
So you might work for a week to make, a couple grams of product, but that product is worth like a couple $1 million. But it's like a few grams, you know what I'm saying? Like it was like, I knew that this is how this company makes money. Like okay. I could see it. Like I was directly responsible for that.
Yeah, you were. I think the general term that's used is production. In the sense that
exactly.
you were producing the thing that actually was how the company makes money, right? Versus designing it, and you don't really see how it makes money. You don't really see how they produce. You just did the design, you did the engineering, you did the production. Yeah, it's kind of like we need to get this. I was going to use a 4-letter word that I shouldn't have used. I forgot it.
That's exactly the mentality, right?
No, yeah, but I get your point. Like we need to get this thing done. Because we have a certain quota that we have to meet it that, and everything we do is essentially, you've not sold it yet, but you can see the dollar signs when the product comes out.
Yeah, exactly. And then also you can see the way the pressure, the authority filters down in the organization. Yeah. Where it's like, it goes from where's the product to who's responsible for the product to why are we not making money. Like it moves very quickly up the ladder. Like, so at that stage, it's like people high up the ladder wonder, like, where's the money? So like it's a very high pressure environment in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah. So my first time working in manufacturing, and it was very interesting experience. I would say you work with a bunch of different people, and at the end of the day, you have the same end goal. And I would say that because the pressure was kind of like on everyone, you build a lot of like strong relationships, camaraderie with the people that you're working with and things like that. It was a very good office culture. Like everyone is kind of like, similar goal, like get the pressure off. So it was a good experience. I worked with Pfizer for something like that, maybe 18 months.
Okay.
Yeah, that was probably my last full-time job where I was like a full-time employee.
Okay.
Was at Pfizer. Yeah. And then everything since then has just been kind of contracts and things like that.
Okay. So let me ask you one more question about the Pfizer job. Like, what were you doing? I know you said you were in production, manufacturing. What was your role within that team specifically, or in a group?
So it was process engineering. So process / kind of a little bit of automation engineering. So a lot of process design, testing, implementation, support. It was kind of like all of that kind of put together. So design the process, testing the process, making sure the process runs smoothly, and then essentially making sure other people can run the process when you're not there and things like that.
Okay.
So yeah, at the time, everything is automated. So like it's all PLCs and things like that.
Okay.
So that was my first introduction to PLCs, actually.
Okay.
Was at Pfizer, yeah.
So you did the Pfizer job. Like you said, every other job you've had was really full-time in the office. What exposed you to contract jobs, number one? And why did you decide to take a leap to start exploring contract jobs?
So at the time, I was talking with this recruiter. And he was mentioning about the small company in Massachusetts that I guess they what you call like a system integrator. So basically they would come in, design, implement, integrate the system. And then you would like the client company would just pay them and they would just be doing this from site to site. Mm. And what I realized is that with co-op culture, and I kind of like working for a client and then being able to leave. So I kind of decided I wanted to keep doing that. So I went to go work for the contracting company. And funny enough, my first contract was Pfizer. so they basically were like, you know what, you work for them, we're just going to throw you back to them. So I ended up going to go do client work for a Pfizer site in North Carolina. Okay. And so at first I worked for Pfizer in Massachusetts, and now I was working for Pfizer in North Carolina. Okay. Yeah, so I was in North Carolina for about a year. I was doing client work for them. So they were building a new facility in North Carolina. So I was, like from the ground up, like there were still like construction workers on the site. Like I was wearing a hard hat and safety vest every day. Yeah, on the site. You was kind of supporting the construction effort essentially and integration of all the systems. Exactly. When I mean construction, I don't mean building the building. I mean like integrating of the equipment and stuff, the process equipment into the building. Exactly. So in these projects, what they do is they basically integrate the equipment while they're constructing the building. Because it's much easier to do that than you construct the building and then you got to figure out like all the electrical, how to bring it in. So they do it at the same time. So you have like the people who literally are like hammering and sawing the building, and then I was on a computer just like making sure everything was working and things like that. Mm-hmm. That was my first contract job. Yeah. Okay. Out of school. Yeah. So you said it was in North Carolina. Yeah, North Carolina. Yeah. Did you have to move for this job, or were you flying back and forth? So for these kind of projects, oftentimes because the project is so large, they have to bring in people from all over the U.S. So some people, I guess people who are older with families, they're coming in Monday to Friday. They're flying Friday night, coming back Sunday night, like because they're going to be with their family on the weekends. But because I didn't have a family at the time, so I was just like, I'm just going to stay out there. Like I'm not going to be flying back and forth every week. So I mean, sometimes I would fly to Boston or New York like once in a while, but it wasn't every week. Like I was flying. Did they host you? Yeah. So all that stuff is, business expenses and stuff like that. So I was actually living in a hotel. I was living in like a hotel suite for like a year. Okay. Yeah, in North Carolina. So I had like a rental car. I was driving into work. Everything was expensive. Like literally, it was the cheapest year of my life. In terms of like me spending my own money was very rare. Yeah. Because like if you're there, you're getting per diem for the food. You get obviously the room and board, and that's fantastic. I want that kind of job. Yeah, no, it was the first time I wasn't mad to put gas in the car. That I was like, I'm getting the money back. I might as well fill up the tank, I might as well fill up the tank. So it was versus now where it's like, it's your own money that's, literally burning. Okay. It was a good year. I think I learned a lot at that job, actually. Because at the time, I was probably not as qualified for the job, but I was able to kind of start the job and learn a lot of things like on the job. They say fake it till you make it, but this time I was like doing half faking and half like teach me. So I was doing that for about a year. So I learned like a lot of stuff on the job. At the time, it was also low pressure because since all the systems were being brought up, it wasn't like they were live in manufacturing and things like that. So this is where you can like do tests and learn a lot about PLCs, I would say, and like the different aspects of it. So you were working with PLCs at this time? Yeah. A lot of Emerson Delta V. So I was working PLCs. I was working with different kinds of equipment from like electrical, like repeaters to like everything in that kind of that avenue. And I learned a lot about the different equipment and things like that also that I didn't know beforehand. That's awesome. That's pretty cool. Yeah. So it was basically like a crash course year of like automation, building automation, PLCs, all that stuff. Okay. That's pretty cool. So obviously it was a contract job. Right? Yeah. Teams from pretty much around the world, everybody's trying to build this building. And because you're building the building, you kind of have the time for when the building is being constructed, right? So you have time to kind of do the stuff. But at some point in time, it's done. What did you do next? So after the year, basically asked me if I wanted to move to North Carolina full time. Oh. So at the time, it was a few options. It was either stay in North Carolina full time, move to like another client in I think Houston, and then there were also other clients in like California also. So I asked them like, oh, are there any clients in the DMV area, like Maryland area? So they're like, yeah. So I ended up literally, I think end of 2021, I moved to the DMV. So, and I've been in the DMV ever since. It's been 3.
All right. So help me understand this. So this company, this contract office kind of thing, what they basically do is get a bunch of contractors together. They're a system integrator, right? So they probably hire a company, but they hire a lot of contractors to kind of get the different jobs done, right? So they hire you as I think it's called 1099. Is that right? 1099?
Yeah.
Employee. That basically means you're a contractor. I want us to talk about the differences between a 1099 employee and a W-2 employee at some point.
Okay.
So they kind of hired you, they sent you to North Carolina for this 1 year. You learned a lot through that experience. I'm guessing a lot of people you're also working with were also contractors.
Yeah, almost everyone, except for people who work for the client directly. Yeah, anyone I worked with day to day was also a contractor as well.
Well, also a contractor. Right? And then when the project was done, they said, do you want to stay in North Carolina? Basically, I think what that meant, so you can let me know if this is right, is that do you want to keep working with this particular client, or do you want to change to different clients? It's essentially what it would have been. And your role would have changed a little bit as a result of that. That's correct. Right?
Yeah. So if I had stayed there permanently, what would have happened is I would essentially be the client representative for their company there, right? So I would almost be a full-time employee in that, but just like without like, the benefits and all that stuff. But I would be like their representative for that client on that site.
Okay.
So I'd have to move there permanently though.
Permanently. Yeah. And then you said, I'm not sure I want to do that. Why Maryland? Because based on the story we've talked about so far, you were in the Northeast, New York, that was your thing. New York, Boston was your jam. You go take this opportunity in North Carolina. Why the DMV area?
So I actually really like North Carolina because the weather is a little bit better, in my opinion. But also, there was never any traffic. Like, it was my first time outside of like a city, for real. So I realized that, I can kind of do suburban. It's not too bad, actually. So I kind of wanted like a happy medium.
Okay.
And also I had friends in the DMV also. So I was like, it works out for everyone, right? So I go somewhere where I already have friends. And then also you get a little bit of city, like DC, a little bit of the Arlington area. And then also the suburbs like Maryland, Virginia, things like that. So the DMV was kind of like the perfect place to go to right after.
Okay. So you go to the DMV area because you had friends there, right? And it kind of gave you the kind of similar environment to what you were looking for. There was a client in the DMV area that you were supporting when you first joined, yes? And how long were you there for?
I was with that client for about a year.
Okay.
Yeah, I was with that client for about a year. So it was similar work to the work I was doing in North Carolina. I guess they were more advanced in kind of like there, and where in the construction that they were. Like the building was already up. The equipment was already inside the building and everything like that. So that was just peer testing like I was doing for that company. I was just running all the equipment, the PLCs. And it's the first time I was running processes from like remote. So yeah, that's the first time I was at home pressing a button and then seeing if it worked and then turning it off.
Explain that to me a little bit, because I would like my experience with PLC has always been in person. I think you and I kind of talked about that offline a little bit. But when you say you were working processes from remote, how were you able to monitor what was going on? Was it just through the data acquisition system that was there, or did you have video cameras that were showing you whether or not things were working or not working correctly?
So it was the data acquisition system. So the thing with PLCs is essentially you have everything on kind of the remote system.
Yeah, and it's instrumented in a sense. You have a bunch of sensors that are monitoring the states and things like that.
Yes. So essentially what was important was to get the necessary feedback.
Okay.
All right. So, for example, if I turn on some sort of air valve or something, I should get a feedback of a certain pressure. All right. So if I don't get the feedback, then either the valve is not on, right? So either there's an issue communicating from the physical equipment to the remote system, or there's an issue with the physical equipment. Like it's not able to provide the air. So like it was like, from there, you can kind of start troubleshooting and figuring out what was wrong. So a lot of the times for automation, people use what are called like PLC coding libraries. So these libraries have been used for a very long time. They've been vetted. Basically, the code works, right? So majority of the time, it's a physical issue if the code isn't working. It's something physically there that someone has to go look at, and someone on site has to physically like fix somehow. It's only when you have like brand new code where it's now you're looking through the code to try to figure out like, what's wrong, like, and things like that, or you're testing the code. But if it's code that's been vetted and been already proved to work, then at that point, it's a physical issue with the physical device.
Okay.
Yeah. But engineering is, because everyone has different engineering backgrounds. So usually, like, if something goes wrong, the first people that get blamed is automation, right? Because most people don't understand automation. So they always think it's something that they don't understand that's not working.
Yep.
Yeah. So the first people that people call up is, what's wrong with the code? Where it's like, we know the code works. So you have to look at, what's around you to figure out why it's not working.
So it's very convenient to blame somebody else, especially if there's any sort of, nobody wants to be the one that made a mistake, right? So it's very easy to blame somebody else first and then find out you are wrong than it is to say, hey, let me check myself first. And all right, so you were working for this client in Maryland, and you were doing on-site sometimes and doing off-site sometimes. So you were doing the remote stuff. And then
that's correct.
And one thing that I think we kind of need to clarify for the audience is that now you primarily do the remote work. So you still do the same automation things, but you primarily do it remotely. But this was the first time you really got exposure to kind of doing the remote portion of it, right? When you were in North Carolina, it was really on-site.
Yeah. I was on-site every day in North Carolina. But when I got out here, the DMV was the first time that I realized I could do a lot of the work remotely. Some people do work remotely, but usually it's more experienced people. So at the time, I definitely wasn't kind of at the experience level where they would let me be programming and stuff remotely. But that came slowly over time, and I was like, okay, I can do the majority of the work remotely.
Did you ask for it, or did they just offer it?
It's a combination of both. So for that project, I think slowly over time, I just started coming into the office less and less. Yeah, to the point where it was like, hey, he's just not in the office. So at that point, it was like, okay, he's working remotely. So I remember there was a time where I hadn't gone onto the site for like 2 months. And I remember the first time I went back to the site, it was a new company as well. So they had hired like new employees, blah, blah, blah. So people were like, who is this guy? Like people were looking at me like, there were people who'd never seen me before. So a funny story actually happened. Some lady walked up to me and she, I think I was sitting in like a common area on my computer, and she came up to me and she was like, do you have a work badge? And I was like, yeah. And like, I don't know how many Black people they were used to seeing that on there. Maybe I was just going for too long. But I was like, what kind of, I'm literally on the company computer right now. Like, no, I broke in to use the Wi-Fi. Like, I don't understand. But it was just a very interesting question. But
it might just have been the fact that, you hadn't shown up for like 2 months, right? So
yeah, but I think also
I'm guessing when you were working remotely, were you having meetings where you're on camera or no?
Well, yes and no, right? But also, it wasn't meetings with her. Like, she wasn't in my department.
She didn't know who you were. So she was just trying to verify. And maybe the skin color may have played a role in that. We don't know, right? Maybe not. She could have done the same thing to somebody who, I'm guessing she's white, so she could have done the same thing to somebody who's white. We don't know.
So I didn't want to mention her race, but she was actually Indian.
Oh, she was Indian?
And the thing was, so funny enough, I kind of think I saw the situation building up. So it was her, and then she was there with an older, whiter gentleman. Okay. And I could kind of see them looking at me like, who is this guy? And I think essentially they sent her because there was less of a racial divide. No, I 100% think that's what happened, because I think it was the white guy.
Send the minority to go question another minority. That way it doesn't look as if there's a race issue going on.
100%. And I don't really know why she was trying to play security guard. Like, I think there's some places where it's like, okay, you see someone new, it's like, how did this person get in here? But with the level of security it requires to get in the building, get upstairs, like, and then have a work computer, like, at that point, I don't think that's necessary. But that kind of goes to show you that, like, in some places when you don't see enough Black people, they stand out, right? You start wondering, like, how did this person get it? So things like that.
So I understand what you're saying on one hand. On the other hand, I would say that I am familiar with companies where they encourage them to ask questions if you see somebody new, right? Ask them to show you your work badge or whatever, right? Because they try to do like essentially physical security. They don't want you to like hold somebody and say, oh, no, that's not what the intent is. But basically it's like, if you see something, say something in mentality, right? So if you're working in your office area and you see somebody who you've never met before and you don't really know the person, you can ask, say, do you work here? And they show you their badge, then that's sufficient. So I don't know if that was kind of scenario that was going on in this area. I guess what you were saying is, hey, like, well, there's enough physical security around, we don't need you to do it. There are other people that do that kind of work. Well,
yeah. Plus, I'm a bit skeptical of places that ask the employees to do security work. It's like, I mean, your job is to secure the building. My job is to work. So, like, I think you have to. In all honesty, like, I mean, otherwise, I mean, I'm walking around asking, "Do you have a badge? Do you have a badge? You know what I'm saying?" Yeah, like it's. So I think like when you start,
I like that. That's so funny the way you said that.
Yeah, it's like I mean, so I think if your security is right, then you don't have to burden your employees. I think there's a case where someone looks like they don't belong.
Okay,
like that obviously exists, but I think if it's not that case, I think you can kind of like mind your business, like as people try to say these days. You know what I'm saying? Like it's okay.
So you work with this client for how long?
This was the first client, so I was with them for a year. Yeah.
Okay. So you worked with them for a year, and then when the job was over, then what did you need to do next? What's the next step?
So I started working for another client based in New Hampshire.
And all the time you were working with still the same system integrator company, right? So they're the one placing you with the different clients, yes?
At this time, so this was the New Hampshire client was the first client that I found myself. Yeah, that was just me. So I started working with them, and that was fully remote. Like I'd never been to New Hampshire before. Yeah, so
nice
my job
place.
was like,
nice place.
Really, I've never even.
Especially if you go like in the fall or in the spring, when the leaves are either just coming in or they are browning. Or nice place. But go ahead.
Okay. I had a coworker who was from New Hampshire when I was working in Massachusetts. Actually, I think he used to commute from New Hampshire.
Okay.
But I think the state slogan for New Hampshire is like, is it give me liberty or give me death? Something like that. It's one of those very radical states in terms of,
I'll go check that.
Yeah. Something like when it comes to like taxes, where it's like, they don't like taxes. They don't like stuff like that. So and the coworker I worked with was very much along that line.
Okay.
Where it was like, I'm pretty sure he has guns in his house. Like I was like 90-something% sure he has guns in his house. Oh. Yeah, very, very full-blooded American. Yeah.
Okay, so
So I worked with them, and that was fully remote project. Like they mailed me a laptop immediately. Like I just started working on the project immediately. So
and pretty much in the same line, automation line, correct?
Just the same exact line. Yeah.
Okay. You said you found them yourself. So I mean, how did you do that? Was that just using like LinkedIn, Dice, those kind of places to kind of find them? Or
so funny enough, a recruiter actually reached out to me about it, and then we started discussing the project more and more, and then they were kind of giving me the details about it, and I was like, oh, I think I like this one. I think I'd want to work with this on this project. Yeah, and then I don't even think I interviewed with the client themselves. I don't remember. I don't think I interviewed with the client themselves. I think it was just like the recruiter brought it to me. I said I liked it. They sent my resume to the client, and the client was like, "Yeah, let's go."
Okay, good.
So I don't think there was a formal interview for this. I don't remember.
Okay,
but yeah. So they mailed me a laptop, and immediately they put me on a team. It was funny. My team was all foreigners. It was me. I worked with this Egyptian guy, thick Egyptian accent. The one guy was working from Costa Rica. Like he was in Costa Rica doing the work. And then it was 4 of us. And then there was another guy, also thick Spanish accent. Everyone had an accent. Except for me.
The foreign club.
Yeah. Club. It was literally just, but the funny thing we all had in common was that we were all football fans. Okay. So like literally every meeting started off talking about football. Yeah, either Premier League or international friendlies or something like that. So yeah, because the Egyptian guy was a big Mo Salah fan. So he was.
Well, yeah, obviously.
So we talk about that. So yeah, it's funny actually. That kind of made that job a lot easier because I mean everyone was kind of just put together. People in different locations. And it's all virtual. Like it's not like you meet people in person.
Yeah. So obviously, like we're doing right now, is you get to see their image when you guys are having meetings. But apart from that, everybody's like separate.
Yeah. Apart from that, you don't really know. So
are they all like quote unquote U.S. citizens or no?
The person in Costa Rica, I don't think is a U.S. citizen because he lives in Costa Rica, and then I think my coworker that was Egyptian, I think he may have been a U.S. citizen. And then the third person, I'm not sure. I actually don't know where he was working from. Yeah, so.
Okay. So, I guess, so you worked with this client in New Hampshire. You talked about this team. How long did you work on that project for? And what did you do next when that project was over?
I was on that project for a very long time. I was on that project until early this year, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So almost 2 years.
Okay.
2 years. Yeah. So I was on that project for a very long time. Yeah.
All right. So maybe this would be a good time to kind of talk about you were a W-2 employee. So a W-2 employee is basically a full-time employee. Actually, it's not just full-time. I think part-time workers also get W-2, but basically you're not under contract, right? What that generally means is that you get access to benefits from the company, and that could include things like insurance, maybe a 401k plan, things like that. Versus a 1099 employee, which is kind of like a contract employee, is they just pay you and you are responsible for everything else, right?
For everything
W-2, the company takes out the taxes out of your paycheck and report it to the IRS. 1099, they don't do anything like that. You are the one responsible for taking out your taxes and paying it, and then also doing the other aspects of your benefits and things like that. So tell me, since you've done both, tell me what your experience was with both of them. And then tell me some of the, like, how do you, when you transitioned to like the 1099 employee, especially in the very beginning, how did you take care of the taxes, the benefits, and those kind of things? And who brought you up to speed in that area?
Yeah, so with W-2, like as you mentioned, tax withholding, you get benefits. Your company has to pay payroll tax and things like that. When I was W-2, essentially, as majority of people W-2, you don't really see any of the paperwork. Like you show up, you work, and then you get money every, like however often you get paid or whatever. So with 1099, it varies, right? So some people, their payment structures, they get paid every 45 days. Some people get paid every 3 months. Some people get paid. Some people, depending on the project, like it depends on the pay term, right? Some people get paid every week. Some people get paid every 2 weeks. Some people get paid once a month. It's completely like, it's the Wild Wild West when it comes to contractor, depending on how your contract is negotiated. And then you're doing your own taxes. You're responsible for finding your own benefits. A lot of times you have to get business insurance. So most places, they'll require you to have $1 million policy, which sounds like a lot, the policy is a lot, but in terms of payment, is not that much. Like, I think you can get $1 million policy for like $200 something a month. Like, it's not very, you're required, that's just liability insurance, right? Let's say if anything goes wrong and it's your fault, like, they can cash out the insurance policy and things like that. So for me, I had already been doing my own taxes from my first co-op. So I kind of knew how to do taxes. It wasn't, so now that I was doing it completely myself, where it was like, so originally W-2, you're just doing a tax return, essentially, right? Because the company's already withheld the tax. All you're doing is just verifying the information. Yeah, the delta.
Or getting money back, essentially. Verify the information and get money back.
Yeah, exactly, right? You basically determining whether the amount that was withheld is the accurate amount. If it's not, did you owe more, or does the government owe you back tax? So with the 1099, it's the same, except now you have to keep track of expenses, because the expenses are write-offs, right? So whatever you spend that's in support of the business becomes a business expense. So you have to keep track of that. You have to keep track of exactly how much you're being paid. So you want all your invoices. You have to keep track of how much you spend on business insurance, how much you spend on health insurance, how much you spend on even Wi-Fi, like Wi-Fi. If you buy any business equipment, you want to keep track of that. So now you're just doing a bit more accounting of your business expense, and also how much you're getting paid and things like that. And also you want to keep track of how much work you're doing as well. So with contracting, they don't have to give you 40 hours of work a week, right? Because most people 8-hour work day, 40-hour work week, right? But then also you get paid pre-tax. So like the government hasn't taken out the tax yet. You get basically the I don't know what the correct term for this is. Is it gross?
The gross, you're getting gross income.
You're getting gross income, exactly.
But so the W-2 employees get net income, right? All the things have been taken out.
Exactly. So you also have to save a certain amount of money for that, right? So basically you can't spend all the money you get. You have to save a certain percentage for that you're going to have to pay the government later on. Some people pay taxes quarterly. Some people paid one lump sum at the end of the year. Some people pay halfway through. They pay in 2 installments. It's whatever works for you, right? Most people that pay quarterly are people who don't trust themselves to hold on to money for 12 months. So they want to just be paying it quarterly. If you have a good idea of where you want to park the money and things like that. So this is where you kind of have to do more financial gymnastics, right? Right? Because it's like, okay, you could put the money in a high yield savings account. So now you're making money off of the money that you have to pay the government. Or if you have a bit more risk tolerance, you can put it in the market, or you could invest it. If you invest it in something else, that also becomes a business expense. So now you're lowering your income by doing that. So you're lowering the taxes you have to pay. So this is where you have to get a lot of financial education to determine how you want to do it. If you're 1099, some people don't really look into it that much. They get the income, they save a certain percentage of it, they spend like they regularly will spend, and then they pay the tax, right? But with 1099, you have more flexibility in terms of your tax structure, right? Because you could basically determine your tax bracket based on how you invest and how you spend. Yeah.
I think what you're saying is there are more levers that you can manipulate.
Exactly.
But when you manipulate these levers, some of them could be dangerous, right? If you don't know what you're doing, you could put yourself in a bind, right? Because you still have to pay the tax man. And he doesn't care that XYZ happened. But at the same time, what I'm hearing you say is basically a 1099 employee is basically like an employee that has a business, right? You can write off your business expenses and that could be beneficial compared to like a W-2 employee that nobody cares about, quote unquote. Well, that's not necessarily 100% true, but for the most part, nobody cares about business expenses, right? It's very simple.
At that point, at W-2, a lot of times your company is taking on the burden of your business expense. So, for example, most companies, they'll reimburse you for anything you have to buy for work, or if you have to drive for work, they'll reimburse you for gas, things like that, right? They're taking on the burden of you as an entity, essentially.
Correct.
Whereas with 1099, you have to be in control of your own entity. So it's like you have to keep track of everything. If you have to drive for work, things like that, if you have to get a hotel, car, all this stuff is, business expense. And I think it's very, very important to get the proper education for this, because I think there's a lot of information out there that is incomplete, I guess, is the best way to put it. So I think you have to basically read as many different sources to figure out exactly how you want to structure your tax situation, I guess.
So tell me about that. Like, how did you get the education?
It was a lot of YouTube. Yeah, go ahead.
And specifically, in the very beginning, the first time you made the slip, right? Essentially, I don't know, did you study beforehand before you decided, okay, I'm going to make the slip? Or you made the slip and then you said, oh, sure, I have to start dealing with all of this stuff. Let me get myself educated on what to do and how to do it.
So I think I've always kind of been interested in finance and economics. So a lot of the information I had already picked up. Funny enough, I think I started watching like the news. Like I started being like actively an old person. Like I would say like around 2017. Okay. Where it was like, I was watching the news. I was keeping track of like what was going on with like interest rates, learning about the banking system and stuff like that from like 2017. So I kind of already had an idea of the things that people were doing in business and things like that. So when I kind of made the full leap, it was just about making sure that I had the 100% of the information, not just, 60, 70, or 80% of it. So it was about just doing more research. And then, there's a lot of websites that have research. There's like tax calculators that kind of give you like approximation of how much you pay in tax, things like that. So like there's definitely ways to be ahead of the curve. So
now if somebody's going to transition to doing this, right? And I know you kind of talk in general terms, but if somebody's going to transition to trying to do the 1099, become a 1099 employee, a contract worker, is there a resource that you could point out to say, hey, either go read this book? It's not complete information, but it's a good starting point for you to start building your knowledge on. Whether it is a book, whether it's a website, whether it is whatever it is, like what's one place you would tell them to go to maybe start the journey of educating themselves?
I would say Google and YouTube, I think, are the two biggest knowledge stores that I used. A lot of Google, like I read a lot of different articles, about people kind of breaking down the process. YouTube as well. Like I think if you go on YouTube, find any video that's longer than probably like 25, 30 minutes, they're breaking down the information like pretty well. So you just have to have the attention span to sit down and absorb the information and kind of take notes and things like that. Yeah, and I think the thing about 1099 is it gives you a lot of freedom, I guess, in a sense, in terms of how you want to structure certain things versus W-2. You don't really, I guess W-2 takes the thinking away, right? You don't really have to worry about too much. So I guess it depends on your appetite for risk. But I also think it's better to do these things young, right? Like you don't really want to have a family and be experimenting. That's not a recipe for success. So you want to have kind of done the research and done it while you're younger, so that if you do end up going that full-on path, like you're not starting from the beginning. So I think the 20s is definitely a good time to be experimenting with these kind of things. So
let me ask you a slightly different question. What about the benefit side? So we kind of focus on the taxes a lot, but how do you deal with the benefits portion of things? The benefits and let's say retirement savings portions of things from a 1099 perspective?
Okay, so from the benefits perspective, there are marketplaces, especially government marketplaces for health insurance that give you cheaper health insurance. I think it's still going to be slightly expensive than the workplace plan, but you have to remember that it's a business write-off, right? So you spending the money pre-tax. I guess health insurance is pre-tax anyway. So yeah, you can go to government marketplaces like Virginia has a health insurance marketplace. Every state has a marketplace, right? For self-employed people.
So it's like an outcome of Obamacare, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. It was an outcome of Obamacare, yeah. So initially, I actually tried to get Obamacare, but I didn't realize the financial status you have to be in to qualify for Obamacare. Yeah, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. But yeah, then I went through the government marketplaces for insurance. And then for the retirement plans, you essentially have to get a Roth, right? So because you can't get a company 401k, but a Roth does the same thing, similar.
A Roth IRA?
Yeah, or a traditional IRA. One, you can get both, right? So, and then you can determine whether you want to do. Well, if you're 1099, all the money you invest in is going to be pre-tax. Because I think every year you change this, right? But this year you can contribute about $7,000, I think, into an IRA account. Yeah. So
and if you're doing both, you have to split it between them. You can't.
You have to split it between each. No, you can't do 7,000 each. It's 7,000 total. So you just, at this point, you're doing it yourself. So now you have to get education in terms of that. I mean, at that point, you determine whether you want someone to be basically taking charge of your account or you want to pick the investment yourself, things like that. But I think that's knowledge you should know whether you have a 1099 or not. I think that's knowledge that I kind of knew before I started doing 1099 work. So the investment part, you have a more hands-on approach with that, or you can just have a hands-off approach depending if you want someone to be basically in charge of your account, if it's Fidelity, Vanguard, all these companies out there. So that wasn't a great kind of leap for me to go from W-2 to 1099 and handle my retirement accounts, things like that.
Yeah. So one thing I would say, and I have to go back and look into this, I think that, like the IRAs, the Roth IRAs, let's just call it IRAs, whether Roth or traditional, everybody has access to that, regardless of whether or not you're 1099 or W-2, right? So
regardless,
there are income limits.
Yeah, I think it's
determine whether or not you can put.
Something like that.
Yeah, there are income limits, and I think it also affects like whether or not you can use a Roth or versus a traditional. But generally, everybody has access to that. Generally, I should say, not the case. There are also like other vehicles as well, like the STP available for quote unquote self-employed. I would imagine that the 1099 can of course put you in that category as well. I know I read about some of them. I've not really spent a lot of time with it because, I'm W-2 employee. I've always been. But that could also be another option for being able to put some additional money away. One of the things I was thinking about is that, like you said, the IRA is about a $7,000 limit, but the 401k or the whether Roth or traditional is about 19,000, I think now, or maybe 19 or 20,000. So if I think that, you can use some of these other out there as well to kind of additional money away if you wanted to put more than that 7,000 limit. But the IRS is a good starting place, but there's some other vehicles I think somebody could explore as well.
Yeah, a lot of people, what they do is, they do what's called a backdoor Roth. So it's like you put money individually and then you end up transferring the money into the Roth. So that's ways that people kind of beat the income restriction. And then I think they also beat the limit restriction as well. Doing that as well. So there's ways to put more money into the IRAs.
Yeah, I see your point.
You just have to do some research on that.
One of my goals, I've been slacking off on it a little bit. I wanted to become a financial planner because I thought that this is something that would be helpful for the podcast as well as for our community. Just like understanding what the rules are and providing people that information so that they can make the right steps, helping them with the proper plans and stuff like that. So this is good that we're having this conversation because it reminds me of that, and I need to put it down and say, hey, I may actually need to start thinking about how to do that, and I think I've been procrastinating on it a little bit, so I may need to start on that sooner than later. So you talked about the taxes, you talked about the benefits, health insurance part, you talked about the retirement portion of it. Let's talk about the other aspects of being a 1099 employee. Like, so you actually two parts I want to talk about here. I want to talk about corporate culture from a 1099 perspective. That's number one. But also I want to talk about, because you've done 1099 where you're on site and you've done 1099 where you're remote, right? So I would like you to talk about remote versus in-person corporate culture and experience and what your experience has been, what your thoughts are regarding all of that, and how do you manage perception in that case, right? Because if I'm in the office, you can see me dress, you can see me talk, right? If I'm remote, you're not really seeing all of those different things, right? How do I basically present my best foot forward in those areas?
Yeah, I think for 1099 corporate culture, you definitely feel it, like in terms of like your interaction with the client coworkers. Well, they know that you're not going to be there for a very long time. So a lot of the interaction is, I think it's more akin to networking, right? Where it's like you meet people, if you have something in common, you strike a conversation, or if it's about work, things like that. And then you kind of know like, oh, this is someone I want to continue to interact with, whether versus like if you're W-2, that's your coworker every day or until you leave the company, right? So it's like you don't have to move as quickly when it comes to networking. I guess the situation can be more over time. Whereas 1099, people like immediately people like ask you questions like, oh, what company do you work for? Things like that. Like, how long have you been working there? And then if they feel that your professional history is like something that's valuable to them, they'll immediately be like, oh, how do you on LinkedIn? Or they'll even want to talk about how I became 1099, things like that. I think from that perspective, the interacting with people, with coworkers is very much, you kind of get to see where everyone's professional development is going to be, right? Because people are always looking for ways to improve. Like people always are, they were like, oh, someone's doing this. This might be something I would be interested in as well. So I think it's a very educational role that you're in. You get to learn from your coworkers and they also get to learn from you. Versus being remote, you don't build as much workplace rapport, I guess. So if you're remote, the focus is mainly based on your technical skills, right? Because that's what people see. People don't really see the person behind the work. So at that point, your work has to be very good. I think if you're remote and 1099, that you're probably the most expendable person in the company. Right, because there's no face to the name, and you're a contractor. So the company can let you go anytime. You don't have to worry about severance or benefits or any of this stuff. So you have to be very, very good technically to be remote and 1099. I remember during COVID, when a lot of workers were transitioning to remote, they were saying that just being remote actually makes you more expendable, period, whether you're 1099 or not. Right, because at that point, what happened was companies started to realize that people being remote did not drop workplace productivity, even though they knew people were working less. I mean, some companies are tracking your mouse clicks, they're tracking your keyboard involvements, things like that. So they knew people were working less, but the productivity didn't drop. So a lot of people's, and that's why we saw later on, we got so many layoffs, right? Because a lot of companies realized that we're probably oversaturated in different departments and we have way more people than we need, right? So if you're remote and you're 1099, you have to be needed and your work has to be really, really good. In order to kind of stay on with the company, I guess.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. All right. So I'm going to deviate a little bit. You were saying earlier that, hey, if you are a 1099 employee, especially if you're remote, you need to be top notch, right? Your work needs to speak for you because it's going to advocate for you in places where you're not physically present. And in this case, you're almost never physically present because you're remotely. Let's talk about work-life balance though, right? So that's something, if you are not remote, you're in the office, you come home and yes, you can mentally be thinking about work, but you have that physical separation from work. Tell me a little bit about work-life balance being a remote employee. Tell me a little bit about work-life balance being a contractor. I don't know if it's different for contractors versus W-2 employees, but I would like you to kind of, based on your experience, tell me some of the things you've noticed.
Yeah, I think with the contractor is the bit of, there's slightly more uncertainty. Sometimes the work could require you to go on site. Like earlier this year, I went to North Carolina and I was out there for a week for a client. So that was last minute. I found out that I needed to be there Saturday. And then Sunday, I drove down to North Carolina, got a hotel, got a car. So you have to have the bandwidth, the ability to deal with uncertainty in that regard. Also, contracts change all the time. The contract is basically dependent on the company's financial situation. So sometimes they might just say, we're running out of money for this project. Or because the project is, overbloated. So they'll say, oh, we want to cut costs. So you have to have a certain to manage uncertainty.
Okay.
So for the work-life balance, though, if you're remote, you essentially kind of get to make your own hours a little bit. Also with contract. So as long as the work is done, no one really cares whether you're doing it from 9 to 5 or you're doing it from 10 to 6 or you're doing it even after 5 p.m. Like as long as the work is done, that's the most critical aspect of it. So at that point, you don't really have a stringent schedule. So at that point, you're in charge of your own time management, which is good. Because, for example, if you want to do things during the day, sometimes, a lot of offices close, around 5 p.m. So it's just things you want to do during the day you get to. So I think the work-life balance is very good if you're someone who has good time management, all right? And who's someone who doesn't need a strict schedule. But some people don't work well with that kind of freedom. So then, so it kind of depends on your constitution as a worker.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for me personally, the work-life balance has been very good because I think I deal better in environments where I have flexibility and freedom and things like that. So I think it's allowed me to work a bit better. Some days you want to work at night. Some days you want to work early in the morning. Some days you want to work during the day. So it's been good for me personally. I think the work-life balance has.
Okay. One thing we didn't dive into, which, or maybe because I'm also an engineer and I'm familiar with the automation perspective a little bit, is really that industry right now and what's been going on over the years. I guess 2 questions for you there. I guess the first question would be, do you think that's an industry that's growing? That's number 1. Number 2 would be, would you encourage younger immigrants, in this case, our audience is primarily the African immigrants, to explore that as a potential opportunity? And then I'll add one more question there, which would be, do you feel that for somebody to be effective in that particular industry, if it is a growing industry, that they need a college degree for that opportunity? Or is it something they can do outside of a college degree?
To answer your last question first, I think it's something you can do outside of a college degree, right? Because it's very skill-based. I think a college degree does help because you have sort of a fundamental array of knowledge that you can tie back to, especially with chemical engineering. So with chemical engineering, I already have sort of a chemical/process understanding of what's going on physically, right? So I know the role of the automation. I know the roles of the different programs in the code. Like I know exactly what the physical output is. But then there's some people who have an electrical engineering background in this field and have zero knowledge of the process, like absolutely zero. They're literally just ones and zeros is their only knowledge, and they do quite well as well. So if you just want to focus on the technical aspect of it, that's also fine. Also, so I don't think you need a college degree for it. I think you can take courses. I think specifically for this, you can do some sort of certification program. Yes, I don't think it's necessary to have college education for the job. And then remind me, sorry, what was the first question?
I guess, is this a growing industry? Is this an industry that people should be looking at to join?
Yes. So I think this is, I would say this is a pivoting industry, right? In terms of it's pivoting and growing. So a lot of the technology that's currently being used is in-house, right? So a lot of the remote systems, before you could even access systems from home, you had to be on site to access any of the systems, literally via Ethernet. You have to connect your computer to the PLC, and that's how you upload or download code. Now with cloud and remote desktop and all that stuff, like you can code PLCs remotely. And now because of this has brought on a secondary issue, right? Where now you need strong cybersecurity, you need strong networking and IT infrastructure. So it's like the advancement of the technology and the remote setup has basically opened up newer job opportunities. And now we even have advancements in data analysis. It used to be a lot of the SCADA systems, or kind of the data analysis is done in something called Pi Historian, right? Which is, in my knowledge, as someone who has experience with other computer software applications and things like that, it's not very sophisticated. It's very simple. But now there's talk of analyzing data via better technologies like AWS, Oracle. So the industry is definitely pivoting from what used to be kind of a proprietary industry to now more open source, right? Where different applications and different technologies are being used. So I think it's definitely something that's going to grow. I think the cybersecurity area of it is going to grow. To kind of talk about a side issue is, in America, we have substations everywhere, right? Substations, the backbone of substations is PLCs, right? And
about power substations?
Power substations, exactly. It's PLCs. And right now, one of the most hackable technological situations is a power substation. Like the government is always talking about how China can and is hacking the US substations, right? So because of the advancement in technology in terms of like the remote access and things like that, it's also made the technology more susceptible to people who want to, do like, incorrect things and things like that. So the cybersecurity aspect of it is definitely growing from a PLC perspective. So if you just in computer software or computer engineering or electrical engineering, like there's definitely room for growth in the field.
Okay, good to know. Yeah. So one more question actually let's talk about the cybersecurity aspect of it, right? So obviously I'm familiar with cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
Is there a specific, let's call it certification track or specific, I don't know if it's class or course that's focused on cybersecurity for PLCs? Because I'm not familiar with that, right? Usually when people are doing cybersecurity track, not everybody does this, but generally you start with like the Security Plus, right? And then you go to the next step. But Security Plus is usually entry away, right? You go get the Security Plus certification, then you can go in different directions. And to my recollection, all of the different directions that I'm aware of, I'm not aware of one that was specific to PLC. Is there one specific to PLC that you're aware of or no?
No, so I'm not aware of one specific to PLCs either. A lot of the people, they come from security cloud. And that's another avenue for growth, right? Like cybersecurity specifically for PLCs. Because the network architecture of PLCs is slightly different than the network architecture for other kind of devices and things like that. I don't know if you've heard this. Right now they're calling it IoT, the Internet of Things.
Yep.
Right? Exactly. So that's kind of the architecture that's set up for basically to be reading feedback and data from like external devices and things like that. So the security aspect of that for PLCs hasn't really been. I think it's still a field that's being worked out. But funny enough, I think the way kind of technology advances is a lot of companies, they don't know that it's necessary. So a lot of companies are behind the curve. They find out it's necessary and now they're scrambling.
Yep.
If you're someone who kind of already is at that point now, you're way ahead of the curve, right? Because the demand is coming, is what I'm trying to say. So I think now if you kind of develop some sort of cybersecurity program for PLCs now, it's going to pay off, I think, maybe as quickly as 5 years from now, I think. Maybe even before that. So I think that's definitely something that is worthy of being looked into.
Okay. So I'm going to change direction a little bit, but one of the conversations we were having recently is you told me you were actually going to head off to Nigeria. You went to Nigeria for about 2 or 3 weeks, if memory serves. You came back in one piece. We're glad to see you. I guess my question is a couple of things. Number one is, so you left, if memory serves me right, you left Nigeria sometime in 2001, 2002 timeframe.
Yeah.
The question I had is, how many times have you gone to Nigeria since you left Nigeria, quote unquote, permanently in that time? And then I would like to dive into what your thoughts and perspective was regarding your most recent trip. And what did you think?
Okay, yeah, so I've gone a few times before this year, but this is probably the first time I've gone. Actually, no, this is the first time I've gone where I spent my own money to go. And before I had pretty much gone as somebody's child. But now, this is one of the first time I'm going, I think I would say as a full grown adult. I got to get my own ticket. I have to get my own, make sure my accommodation is good and things like that. So it's definitely a different experience because you start to realize all the things that your parents were kind of doing behind the scenes logistically to make sure that it was a good trip. But at the same time, you also realize some things that they might have overblown also. At this point, basically, you're navigating Nigeria as an adult yourself. So you have to have your own ideas and develop your own viewpoints and things like that. Not every parents and other people have told you about the country. So, but for me, I thought it was a very fruitful trip. I think I realized a few things. For me, everywhere I went, I looked at it financially. I think my viewpoint is very much economics and financial. So everywhere I went, I was kind of just looking around like, okay, maybe this is why people complain about this, or this is why people complain about this. You start to realize certain things about the infrastructure that makes things difficult for business and the people as well.
Could you give me some examples of that, please? Well,
the power issue was definitely interesting. There was a fuel scarcity because of rising prices. So a lot of fueling stations, especially in the area where I was at, they refused to sell because they wanted, some of it was artificial scarcity in terms of they wanted to keep raising prices. And then like a few days later, they would start selling at whatever price they wanted to sell at and things like that. So there was an issue. There was a power issue. Like, I remember I was visiting a family friend's home and she had mentioned that they haven't had power since Eid last year. So that's like June of last year that their neighborhood hasn't had proper power. And like, at first I thought she meant Eid this year, which was March. Right? No, April. So I was like, oh, just too much. She was like, no, Eid last year we haven't had power. I was like, oh, wow. So you see those kind of situations and it's like, okay, I mean, from a business perspective, the infrastructure is not there. Like from in most places, the infrastructure is not there. So you're going to have very innovative ideas if you're going to have a breakthrough business. And I think the biggest thing I realized that Nigeria was a country that wants kind of first world products in a third world environment. Like what I mean by that is one of the things about America is the fact that just like this developed countries in general is I can order something on Amazon and get it tomorrow. Right. The amount of things that we consume in Nigeria as far as people is so large for the infrastructure and resources that we have. Like people are always ordering stuff, things like that. And I realized that we don't have the infrastructure for that. I think we might have to temper our kind of expectations a bit when it comes to the level of consumerism and the kind of the things that we're asking for the infrastructure that we have.
That's a really good question that you just brought to my mind, but I don't want to distract you from this current thought that you're having right now. So one question I forgot to ask you is, your parents, are they still here in the US or did they move back to Nigeria?
So my mom is still here. My dad is in Nigeria, but he goes back and forth. Both of them go back and forth. Yeah.
Okay. And are they retired or are they still working professionally here?
They're retired.
Okay. They're in retirement mode and they're kind of like managing both sides of the stuff. So a couple of things, right? You go back to Nigeria, you've been a few times already, but this was the first one where you paid. But like you said, right, when you left Nigeria, all your friends were in Nigeria. Were you able to maintain those relationships over time, or did they change? Did they evolve? Did it degrade? Like, what's going on with the relationship that you had with friends and family members from the time you left to now?
So, I mean, for me, I was able to maintain a lot of relationships. I think with family, it's different now because, I mean, you're an adult. You're probably not the same individual that they remember. So there's some changes in that regard. But I think the relationships kind of picked up where they left off from that perspective. I think you also kind of get the feeling while you're there that, like, you kind of feel that you're not fully accepted. I think there's something in Nigeria about, like, having a shared experience, a burden, that they feel that while you're family, you're not fully experienced going through that experience with them. They'll treat you as family, but you can kind of still feel like a little bit of this person doesn't know. You know what I'm saying? They're not going through the same struggle exactly. So there's like a shared experience where you just feel like you're not really breaking that layer or barrier. And then also one thing I try to kind of go out of my way to not like, I feel like in Nigeria, like people with money, there's a consistent oppression of poor people in a sense. Like it's very difficult of a country to have money in because there's so much large scale poverty. For me personally, I just don't feel comfortable living like a lavish life in Nigeria. Like I just don't feel comfortable. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like, other people just don't have the same economic situation as you. So at that point, it kind of comes off as oppression in a sense, to me personally. And also, you just don't feel safe. So it's not really a country where you want to have a lot of money in. Like it's not enjoyable in my experience, right? To be
because of
rich
that,
right next to
Like when you say it's not enjoyable, elaborate on that. Like, are you saying because a lot of people have a tough time just trying to do the day to day? That when you live, let us not say lavish, like when you live comfortably,
yeah,
right, it kind of comes off as being, I'm trying to figure out the right word here,
sort of insensitive, I guess.
Yeah, insensitive to other people's plight, right? Because they would like to live comfortably as well, but they don't necessarily have the resources to do so. And one of the things that we all are guilty of is that we compare ourselves to other people, right? That's a normal human thing to do. And it makes it a little bit difficult, which is why you said sometimes jealousy and envy can come into play. And people can actually act on that and actually do things that they would otherwise not do.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also for me, it's like, I mean, we're leaving our house in Ilorin and there's like 10 locks, like on the gate, the house. Like, it's like, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? So it's like, at that point, it's
padlocks. It's not funny, but it's funny.
Yeah, it's padlocks everywhere. Like at that point, it's like, I'm having to do so much work just to enjoy the money I have. That it's like, you know what I'm saying? I don't even feel comfortable. I have the money, you know what I'm saying? So it's that kind of environment where, and I think a lot of Nigerians, particularly the ones with money, don't realize that like if the area around you improves, your quality of life improves as well. I mean, you might have money, but are you really comfortable, in that environment? So that's what I noticed. One of the things I also noticed while I was out there as well.
I see. So tell me about, one of the things people talk about, and sometimes I think of this as like a first world problem. But, people talk about this like sense of identity kind of stuff. I'm not discounting it. I just think that maybe because of different experiences I've had, like somebody that's comfortable that can worry about sense of identity. You know what I'm trying to say? But like, tell me about like sense of identity. What did you think about your sense of identity over time? Right? Like, you were just talking about, hey, like even with family members, right? You're part of the family, but you're not necessarily part of the family in the sense that you share the same blood, but you've not necessarily had the same experiences because of the fact that you were removed and you were in the US, and people assume that if you're in the US, you're living a more comfortable life compared to what they're having. So I wanted to talk about that whole sense of identity. I also want to talk about like, how are you keeping in touch with your heritage, right? What did your parents do to help you maintain that sense of connection to your heritage? But also, what are you doing now as an adult, whether consciously or subconsciously, to keep in touch with that heritage?
Growing up, my parents, especially my dad, he kind of always, he gave us the confidence to realize that my dad believes Nigerians are the best people, like, in the world. So he's very much Nigerian national anthem. Like he's very. So growing up, he kind of always told us, "We're better than everybody." That's basically what he told us. So being in America, I kind of always had the confidence to feel like I don't want to say patriotism, but that respect for my culture and where I came from.
And Nigeria, they carry last.
Exactly. So that was kind of the viewpoint. And then also, like, I mean, my parents spoke Yoruba to us growing up. So all of us speak Yoruba. Like me and my two siblings all speak Yoruba. We all have connections to our family members, to Nigeria. So we never lost anything, even though we were living here, per se. So we always had that strong connection. Like we watched Nigerian news that was on TV all the time here. So we always knew what was going on. Even from a young age, I always knew like a politician was stealing money or doing this or doing that. Like, you know, I knew their names. I knew what was going on. All right, because that's what my dad was, you know, watching or involved in or whatever. So I kind of always had that strong connection to back home. So for me growing up, I consider myself a Pan-African in a sense, in that I'm very strongly believe in the importance of strong African communities, not just in Nigeria, right? But it just happens that Nigeria is the largest population and economy in Africa. So like, you know, they say you can't have a strong Africa without a strong Nigeria. So for me, I always start off with Nigeria. I think if there's development and improvement in Nigeria, the rest of Africa will follow suit, right? So I think for me, I've always been involved in trying to go back home and build something. It's a work in progress, trying to figure out what it is. We're trying to navigate the two different cultures, the two different governments, the laws in the two different countries and things like that. But my thing has always been like, if there's going to be a way to save Nigeria, it's the diaspora, right? Because I think the largest resource we export is the people. You know, it's not the oil, it's not the little bit of cassava or whatever that we might export every year or all these other resources. It's the millions of Nigerians in diaspora who send back money to people in that country. Without that, the country is dead. Like, if we're being honest. So as bad as it is now, it would be the purge without the diaspora. So that's the way I see it.
You know, you talked about diaspora and the connection between the diaspora and the people on the continent. You talked about like the remittances, basically the money being sent. I'm sure you have other quote unquote Nigerian/African friends here in the US. Tell me a little bit about what you think about the remittances. Tell me a little bit about like what tools or services you guys, when I mean you guys, I mean folks are using in your experience to transfer money back home to their family members and the need. And then I also want to hear a little bit, let's start there, but I would like to also hear a little bit about like some of your thoughts, right? Have you tried to do something back home to contribute to the development? Even if you haven't yet, what are some high level things you were thinking about exploring, maybe decided this wasn't going to work? You're still trying to formulate it or make that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, with the remittances, I mean, a lot of us, our parents were, you know, they knew somebody somewhere that had Naira, and that's how they were, you know, going about the remittances, right? So it was very much black market. But now I would say, well, for my generation, I use Tap Sign, right? I would say a majority of us, we're using these fintech companies for remittances. But I will say what's impressed me is that, like, even now my parents are using these fintech services too. So I think if you're getting the older generation, that just shows you how easy it is to use, right? Because they probably get a better deal from someone on the street or, you know, a family member or things like that. But the fact that they're going through the fintechs, it shows that the ease of use is there, and it shows that the demand is there as well. So for me, I think the remittances through the fintechs has been a great way to track the remittances as well, right? Because a lot of the data the government just doesn't have, or no one has the data, right? If you're going through, you know, someone on the street, like, we don't really know how much money is actually influxing into the country, right? But once you start going through a medium where you can have data analysis, we can know exactly, you know, how much is coming into the country and, you know, exactly what areas the money is coming from and things like that. So I think the remittances now through the fintechs is going pretty well. But then also now, most people that want to start a business in Nigeria, they try to start a fintech. It's a service. Like all these companies that you're hearing of that's taken off, well, a couple of years ago they were taken off, were all fintechs. And I remember I was listening to this economist, and he was saying that one of the issues with the Nigerian economy is that we've jumped from goods straight to services. Like, what I mean by that is we have no manufacturing sector. And essentially, in the forming of a proper economy, you're supposed to go from agriculture to manufacturing to services, right? To technology and services. But we went from agriculture, basically abandoned agriculture, skipped manufacturing, and went straight to services, like tech services and fintechs of that nature. And it's like, I mean, like, so we don't manufacture any of our own goods. So for me, I've always wanted to attack that middle area that we missed in our economic development, which is manufacturing. Right? Because the fintech is, that's the sexy idea. That's the thing that everybody wants to do. Like, you have a tech startup, and then maybe somebody from overseas buys a startup, or they invest in a startup, you get foreign direct investment, things like that. But the manufacturing sector is really the sector that's going to carry the economy, right? So I think 90% of the goods in Nigeria are imported. We import tomato paste. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
We import things that we have in the country that we can easily manufacture ourselves. We import. Like, I remember one of my first ideas, actually, when I was thinking about starting something in Nigeria, was a tomato paste factory. And then I read like these papers of people who tried to do it and things like that. And you find out a lot of the issues they had was because tomatoes spoil very quickly. Mm-hmm. So that means that you have to go from basically the farm to manufacturing very, very quickly. But the issue with the roads and transportation and things like that made it very difficult to transition from the farm to the factory, right? Without the tomato basically spoiling in that time span. So it's funny because people have actually tried to do some of these things, and you'll read about like the issues that they've had, trying to do certain things, right? Because, I mean, manufacturing tomato paste in Nigeria will definitely be like a big win, for our manufacturing and sector and things like that. But, you hear about some of these logistical issues and transport, things like that.
I read an article or saw a YouTube clip about a woman. I think she was white, by the way, but basically setting up a tomato paste manufacturing company somewhere in North Nigeria. I've forgotten which state it is. I have to go take a look. I don't know whether or not if it came to be or not, but I know I saw like pictures of her supposedly meeting with like dignitaries and stuff in Nigeria, or whether or not it's actually producing anything, I'm not sure. So one of the things that I was actually thinking about is, kind of along the lines of what you talked about. I thought about it, but I never really put a lot of work into it, I should say, was improving the logistics arena, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I noticed during my trip, I don't know that it is the roads are not great. I'm not going to dispute that. But in some cases, people don't own the trucks. So they actually go to basically the marketplace to go get a truck or whatever. And the people that owns these trucks basically just, in my opinion, just rip them off, right? Like, if I were going to rent, like, let's call it a downfall, and you told me to pay enough for the number of people that I would have carried in that downfall for that period of time, that makes sense to me, right? So if the fare is like, if this thing carries a 15-passenger van, and let's just say each fare would normally be like 2,000 naira, and you told me pay 30,000 naira, right? Because you're basically renting the van for that period of time. That's fine. But usually what happens is that they charge them per item. So if you tell them I want to carry, like, we're using tomatoes as an example, baskets of tomato, they'll say, okay, that's fine, but you're going to pay me, let's just say 500 naira per basket of tomato, right? And maybe I would have fit in 100 baskets of tomato in this stuff. Right? The person just uses it as an opportunity to even make more money than he would have otherwise have made. And I think that makes it non-viable for people, right? Because I have to negotiate with the farmer to buy the tomato in the first place. I put it in the stuff. You just took all my margin and my profits. And then I go to marketplace and people are now trying to underprice the stuff. It's like, it doesn't quite work out. So one of the things I was talking about was systematic way, kind of similar to what's done here in the US, where you have like a marketplace for logistics and you kind of set what the stuff is, and then different people can give you different pricing. There'll obviously be some kind of formula that you use for how you figure out what your pricing is. And the better way to do it would be to actually own some trucks too, so you can keep the prices normal, right? And then you can use kind of like Uber for things like that. Freighting. Yeah, shipping and freighting. And I think that may solve some of those problems. But I interrupted you. Sometimes when I'm talking to people, an idea pops into my head, I just start blotting it out, which has nothing to do with the interview. So please go ahead about talking about tomato paste and some of the things that we import into the country.
That's definitely along the lines, right? Because the issue is transportation. So
why is transportation an issue? Let's talk about that. Why is I don't know why, right? Because yes, the roads are not good, but there are some roads there.
There are some roads,
I think, go ahead. Let me not sway you. I have some thoughts, but go ahead with your part.
Okay. So I think a lot of the issues with transportation has to do with, fuel, right? So fuel cost is going to impact transportation. So if you look at, we have no functioning refineries. So if you look at the cost of fuel per liter in Nigeria, like I would say this, most things in Nigeria, not most things, a lot of things in Nigeria, common goods, I would say, are slightly cheaper in Nigeria than they are elsewhere. Not by much, but it's usually slightly cheaper. But if you look at things like cost of petroleum and things like that, it's essentially American prices. I mean, because that's dictated by whatever the price of import is, right? Because we're importing refined petroleum and things like that. So for most people, right, and then you got people who buying for their generators and stuff like that as well. So for most people, that's already a non-starter for their business, right? Because the cost of fuel is just too high and the infrastructure is not there. So most people, by the time they start doing the economics of the viability, they're losing money just paying for fuel, right? So that's also an issue that the manufacturing companies run into as well. But for transport in particular, you got the cost of fuel, you got roads that, I mean, there are some roads, but they might not be the most logistically like viable way to go from destination to destination.
It's not efficient.
It's not very efficient. Yeah, exactly. And then you have to factor in, I think there is something to say about the difficulty of the terrain in Nigeria, right? And kind of like maintaining equipment and things like that. Maintenance costs factor in as well. So I think logistically trying to transport things around the country is very, very difficult. And now you have to talk about the people, right? Where you're going to have people who they're asking for a cut. By the time you add up all the bribery and then you add up all the bribery and then you add up all your fixed business costs, right? At that point, bribery might even be a fixed business cost as well. Like, you're in the red in most of your companies. Actually, like when I was in Nigeria, I was at my aunt's house and someone was getting a shipment of like what I would assume is probably like fabric from like China or something. And they were like, they got like 2 trucks, like 2 full truckloads of fabric. And they were trying to drive it through the road in like Owoshoki in Lagos. And it's impossible. Like they had to park up the truck on the side and then start moving the boxes by hand, right? That's one issue. And this person distributes the fabric to different storefronts and then they sell the fabric. This is basically the transporter who's having the issue transporting the goods, right? And then in order to transport the goods, the truck had to be basically followed by LASMA, basically like people who have to make sure that other people on the road don't give him problems while he's transporting the goods. That's one cost of a transportation.
Yep.
And then while you had the LASMA doing all the stuff, you had random people, basically vigilantes, who had no business helping the process, who inserted themselves into the process because they saw this as like a money-making opportunity. So that's another issue you have. So, and my mom was literally telling me stories about like, if people try to do construction in the area, if you don't pay the right people, they'll frustrate the construction to the point where it's not going to happen, right? But the funny thing is, she mentioned something that I thought was very interesting. She said that if you paid the right people, not only will they monitor the process, they will make sure it's completed properly. So essentially what you have in Nigeria is you have a lot of people who give themselves jobs that they don't have, and they collect money and they do it better as if it was their own job. So I was like, a lot of times you're forced to basically employ people in your community. That's essentially what I realized. Because if you don't employ the community, they'll frustrate whatever you're trying to do.
The problem with what you just said is that the cost of employing the community is variable because you don't know who the stakeholders are. That's number one. Yeah. And then number 2 is that when you had this cost to the fixed business cost, the opportunity may not be viable.
I agree.
And the problem is that the community doesn't want to hear any of that, right? They just want my own cut. Yeah. They don't care about the rest of the story here. So that's a really good perspective that you brought up.
Yeah, so I think the very things that are positive in our culture sometimes become a negative, right? Right? Positivity is that we have very strong communities, but when that becomes negative is that you as an outsider cannot succeed in doing anything in that community, right? You need people who are heads to that community to essentially support whatever it is they're trying to do. So you have to convince a very small group of people. And a lot of times the convincing that they require is money. So you have like people who are essentially gatekeepers for the success of different communities or different states or different local government areas and things like that, right? So if those people aren't good people, the rest of the people suffer under them. So that's one of the stumbling blocks of trying to start anything anywhere in Nigeria, honestly.
So one thing you didn't say in your answer to this question, you didn't say what you have either thought about specifically to implement and discounted and said, you know what, this was not really a viable idea. We kind of talk generic terms, but is there anything specific that you've thought about or are thinking about that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, the tomato paste, that was a small idea that I realized wasn't going to be viable fairly quickly, actually. I realized that's just not going to be viable. But right now, what I would probably say the biggest thing I'm trying to implement is the solar, but by community, right? So I think the Minister of Power a few months ago said that if Nigeria was going to have functioning electricity, we would need $100 billion a year for the next 10 years. No, like
$100 billion
for the next 10 years. Yeah, or maybe $10 billion, some ridiculous amount of money, right? So it's like when you start hearing numbers like that, you realize that there's nothing that's going to happen federally. So at this point, it's going to have to be community by community and locally. And it's going to have to be small local projects, which in a sense could be good, right? Because what you have is a decentralized system. So a lot of the electricity in America is centralized. So if you have an issue in one power substation, it filters to everybody, right? Like if you do small kind of solar communities everywhere, like some people, electrical issue in one area is not going to impact other areas. So I think part of the advantage that we have in being so underdeveloped is that we get to develop in the way that we want, right? Versus just following like a Western playbook. So for me, definitely, I'm trying to get into like the solar community setup. Right now, a lot of the issues is basically this economic viability because there's definitely a demand. I mean, you're talking about people who haven't had power for months at a time, for a year. Like, and you know, for a lot of people,
it's not funny, but it's funny.
And for a lot of people, it's so normal, they don't even know what the alternative is.
Yep.
Because I couldn't imagine saying I don't have power for a year and it's like everything is okay. Like, I'm just living like, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So it's like, so what are we paying these like distribution companies for, you know?
Yep.
But yeah, so a lot of times in Nigeria, people have issues and they just tighten their belt. You know what I'm saying? There's not enough community outrage inside. But anyway, so for solar, I think it can be viable, but it's not something where the economic impact is going to be felt in a year or 2 years, right? But a lot of people want the money now. Like it goes back to the point that I said that when the quality of life of those around you improve, your quality of life is going to improve as well, right? So for example, let's say now we have a local community that's generating electricity and distributing it themselves, right? Now the small businesses can form in that area that's going to improve the economic vitality of everyone. So now let's say you want to start a tech company, right? Your customers have power. That's easy to do, right? Versus now you're trying to start, like essentially any sophisticated business you try to start now is met with, like, who are the consumers? Let's be honest, like who are the people who can either A, afford the service, or B, I kind of have a quality of life where the service would even impact their lives in any way, right? So I think that's where if you kind of drag people out of poverty, you create the consumers, right? And now you have an economy where the money is flowing and things of that nature. You can't be wondering where the customers are, but the customers don't have money. Like there are no customers. So I think if you give people power, they're going to start small businesses and now money is going to start to circulate. And now you start your own business and they're going to pay you that same money.
I see your point.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the economic vitality it's similar to, like, I think the .com boom in the US or now the crypto boom, right? Where it's like they created industries that were unforeseen, right? Like it's not like the economic vitality of tech or of websites or crypto, like nobody mapped it out from the beginning, right? You know what I'm saying? So it started boosting economic activity and all of a sudden all these new businesses started to form. So I think that's what would happen if we had like these kind of small solar communities. And I like people would feel confident to start businesses. And then you create the customers who you then take the money from later. Like, you get what I'm saying? So,
yeah, it's like a kind of like a circle, right? You give money, contribute, and then they contribute back to you as a result. So it's kind of like
the money is going to come back to you if it's successful. That is my viewpoint. Okay. But of course, it's making it successful that's where you have to earn your money.
Yep.
Figuring out ways to make it successful.
This is one question. I would like to ask it in two ways. Like, in your opinion, what is the primary challenge of Nigeria? And that's the question. So, but I'd like you to answer that question just a general basis, just generally. And then I would like you to answer the question from a business/economy standpoint.
I would say generally, I've kind of wrestled with this idea a bit, right? Because I have friends who will say that the biggest problem in Nigeria is the people. Like they say that the people are unsavable, they're corrupt. There's no, literally. Like you hear you. So sometimes, even me, sometimes I feel like that's the key. But then I had to kind of wrestle back into this way of thinking where, for me, I often see Nigerians as victims of their own situation. So I think the problem is proper governorship or proper government, right? So there's no government in the world that doesn't have some sort of corruption. You can be corrupt on your own time, but when you're on government time, what are you doing for the people, right? A lot of our leaders, they're stealing on government time. Like on government time, they're corrupt. Like time when they're supposed to be doing stuff for other people, they're doing stuff for themselves. So for me, I think proper leadership is our biggest, it has to be our biggest problem, right? And I think, and it's funny because I remember there was one time I was in this discussion about trying to improve tourism in Ilorin, like Kwara State, right? Trying to boost tourism in Kwara State. And I remember I said something like, I think the biggest issue was infrastructure. People come into the state or the city, like, what are the tourist attractions, right? So as a government, you have to invest in these things if you want to boost tourism. You can't just say, I want to boost tourism, but what are people going to come see when they get there? And one person who works directly with the government, essentially what he said was, he basically said, the reason we can't invest in the community is because the people won't know what to do with it. Essentially, we have leaders who have such low opinions of the people that they govern that they don't even think it's worth anything to invest in them because they believe that the people will misuse it or mismanage it or it won't do them any good. But I think sometimes the government has to be an example for the people, right? If you create these kind of environments, the people will rise to the. That's like saying because some people have never known 24/7 electricity, we should never have it because they'll mismanage it when they get it. Like, it doesn't make sense. That level of thinking doesn't. You know what I'm saying? That's why I think our number one problem generally is the leadership. They don't believe in the people at all, which is crazy because you see the success of people elsewhere. Like Nigerians who succeed in other countries, the politicians are the first people to go. Like I think it was like Anthony Joshua who was boxing at Wembley, and like you see like governors from all these states there. Like, you know what I'm saying? But don't you want something like that in your own country? It's very interesting to me, the mindset of some of our leaders. That's why I say our general issue is poor leadership. All over, not just from the president, from the governors, from local government areas, like just poor leadership everywhere.
What about from a business economy standpoint?
From a business economy standpoint, at that point, I might have to still say it's the people. Because I have to say it's the people. Because when you have sort of these fixed, unfixed costs, trying to start a business is almost impossible. All right, because already trying to convince the consumer is an issue. And then we don't have a credit system, credit structure. Everything has to be cash, right? So if people don't have the money for it, they can't really pay for it. So at that point, like your consumer base is already limited, right? Because how many people have that kind of cash just sitting in their bank account? There was a bank that the CBN just basically removed their license. I forget the name of the bank. I have to look it up. But at the time, basically the bank is going to get dissolved, right? And I think they said that, was it 99% of the people who are banked in that bank have less than like 5 million naira in their account, right? So, which, I mean, if you convert that to dollar, that's like maybe $3,000 or something like that in their complete account. 99%. So at that point that's what I mean. Like, who are the consumers? Like, who are the people who are going to be buying these things that are supposed to be viable in this country, right? So you already have limited consumer base. And now when you have all these fixed, unfixed costs, like your revenue is just going less and less, essentially. So I think for me, from economic perspective, it's the people and I don't want to say hand to mouth, but it's very much like there's no sort of large planning. No, like, let me help this boost my community and it'll help me later on. It's like, well, how can I chop today? It's basically like the viewpoint.
That is so true.
Yeah,
and I think that what makes it difficult to do things. One of the challenges to do things in the country, right? Especially for people in the diaspora that try, is because you need to have that. Yes, we understand people need to eat today. That's important, right? But we also need to have the long-term vision of saying, hey, we're trying to march towards here. How do we balance both? Right? But when we try to do stuff and then because you're so focused on the short term, you just take the whole thing and you waste it. Like, nobody's going to come back and try to do something else, right? That's really interesting. So I'm going to ask what I hope will be some quick fire questions. We're kind of like at the end of this. They may not be as quick as I think, but the first question to you is, what advice would you give to others who are considering emigrating from Africa? And I know, obviously, you're more familiar with Nigeria, but we could say, we don't know this, but we could say generally that some of these lessons would apply to anybody from anywhere in Africa rather than just Nigeria. But what advice would you give to somebody who is considering emigration from Africa to someplace else to kind of create a better life for themselves through that process? And also when they get there, how to try to, what to keep in mind so that as they try to make their way through the process and try to be successful being relative, right? That means different things to different people.
Yeah, I think this is a double-edged question, right? Because there's a part of me that says, if you're going to emigrate, there's certain skills that you should already have or believe that you can get that will make you successful wherever you're going, right? Mm. But the second part of the question at the same time is, I don't necessarily want skilled people leaving Nigeria, but but I'm not gonna tell people not to chase economic success. But so I will say this: so I think you should have some skill that you either already have or that you think you can gain fairly quickly that is going to make you successful wherever you're going. I don't think it's a good idea to emigrate and then be trying to figure out what I'm going to do, or I think you should have some sort of concrete plan in place, right? There should be some field that there's a demand for wherever you're going, or and that you know that you're going to be able to be successful in that field. So I think that's number one. Number two is you need to be familiar with the laws of this is me if I was immigrating now as an adult. I would definitely want to know the laws and things like that of wherever I was going. You want to have some sort of familiarity with where you're going. It's not you're not landing and you're trying to figure things out on the fly because, I think one of the worst things that can happen is you emigrate and you land in some sort of civil issue or some sort of criminal issue. That's you lost before you even started, essentially. And that's actually not that uncommon because I've heard stories from especially when my older family members emigrating and things like that. You'll hear stories of people who are into trouble with the law and things like that. I mean, it's not Nigeria. You can't be moving the same way that you otherwise would be moving. So I think those are two things. I think is the familiarity with the laws and then also having a skill that you either already possess or that you know that you can possess fairly quickly that's going to get you a job or some form of economic relevance. Because a lot of these Western countries... Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I was going to say, a lot of these Western countries, they only care about GDP. So if you're not adding value to GDP, they don't want you in the country. So even if they let you in, they're looking to get rid of you, or they just won't let you in at all. So you have to have some sort of economic value or input into the system. I don't even understand why someone with no skill set would just be wanting to move somewhere to do what? You know what I'm saying? So that's the way I view it.
I see your point. And, you just gave me some idea. I think I need to go spend some time thinking about some of the skills that we're talking about, kind of come up with a list of things that people should try to learn so they can be effective on day one in some of these countries that we're talking about. Because some people think, when you travel overseas or whatever, the roads are paved with gold, you pick dollar off the trees, right? That's how they talk sometimes, which is not true because when they come here, even their family members would get rid of them so quickly because things are tough for people here, right? You have to pay for everything that you have. So those skills are really important in the sense of you need to make sure that you have something that you can start doing. And sometimes you can pick up those skills here, but that takes time. If you can pick it up before you come, it's even better. You can hit the ground running. And
I agree.
I love what you said about the law, because immigration for a lot of countries is not a charity case, right? Yes, we understand that there's humanitarian aspects, but generally it is not a charity case, and I never really thought about it like that. These countries care about their GDP or what value you can provide to the stuff, right? So if you come here and if you are not providing any value or if you get in trouble with the law, you're pretty much shot, right? They're not going to give you...
You're going.
Yeah, they're not going to give you an opportunity to correct that mistake and become a productive member of the society. That tag is always going to be with you from that point on. And if you were in a situation where you don't have your papers fully, you're never going to get your papers.
100%. Yeah.
So that's a really good point. I never really thought about that. That's a really good point. So I guess next question would be, what are some of the things you are most hopeful for in your home country, which in this case would be Nigeria, and your current country would be in the US?
I would say for me that in terms of what I'm hoping for in Nigeria is, so I think by 2050, our population is expected to be around 400 million. So for me, what I'm hopeful for is at that point, we have some form of economic salvation. Because 250 million people, let's be charitable and say our population is like 220. Let's really say it's like 250 for real, right? And if we're charitable and we say of the 250, let's say like 210 are in multi-dimensional poverty. I'm being charitable a little bit there, right? But by the time our population is 400 million, what are those numbers gonna look like? So I think at that point, if there's no solution, people in the diaspora are not coming back. Like I think that's it. Like the country is now I don't want to say the Wild Wild West, but it's going to be something very close to it. So I think what I'm looking forward to is that we're going to have to find a solution because there's no other way. Like you're going to have to find a way to start lifting people out of poverty, or it's just going to be like a criminal. I don't want to say a criminal state, but it's going to get to that point. Like, I mean, even now there's already kidnappings in Abuja. There's all this stuff that's going on. Like, we don't want that trend to essentially continue, right? Because if you push people enough, everyone has a threshold where they'll start resorting to criminality to feed themselves or their family. Mm-hmm. So I think, funny enough, I think it kind of sounds like I'm talking about everything I'm not looking forward to. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm looking forward to people in the diaspora, kind of, especially now. I think a lot of the young people now are starting to trying to be involved in the country, albeit from a tourist perspective now. But I think it's eventually going to start to develop economically as well. I'm definitely looking forward to see how the younger people in the diaspora kind of start to navigate and start to make decisions that I think will impact the country, even more so than our parents did economically, right? Because a lot of our parents, they just build houses and that's it. Not all the houses are built. I think we can focus on business. So that's what I'm definitely looking forward to.
Okay. Yeah. I think my next question, which you already started to answer, was what are some of the things you are most worried about in your home country and in your current country?
I think in terms of what I'm worried about in Nigeria is the leadership. I think the party systems are kind of a joke, essentially. Like I think the two parties are very similar or essentially the same, which is the same issue America is having right now. A lot of the governments are determined, or the leaders are determined in Nigeria is your turn, my turn. Like it's people, they've already have people like 3 next generations in line for governorship, or like, you know what I'm saying? How can the president be saying like, it's my turn? Like where, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, it's things like that where you know that things are already been set in stone and the elections are just for show. So I think that's definitely a sign of worry in the country. And I think in the U.S., actually what I worry about in the U.S. is very similar. It's poor leadership as well, right? Because the election they have coming up between Biden and Trump, where you have 2 people nobody supports, but yet they're the 2 front runners for the presidency. So it's like the American political system has been hacked. Like, you know, and it's funny because I think if you give wealthy people enough time, they can hack any political system. In this state, I think America has completely been hacked. I think what people want is almost irrelevant at this point. You know, they're going to just be passing whatever laws work for the people who are lobbying for the government and things of that nature. So I think both countries have a leadership problem that they're going to have to sort out.
What are some of the things you are most grateful for in your home country and in your current country?
I will say, I think what I'm grateful for is the quality of the people in Nigeria. While economically we're shot, but there's something about like emotionally that makes Nigerians very, very happy people. You know, so I think like even during the African Cup of Nations, regardless of what was going on, you know, everybody was supporting the team. Like there was a camaraderie that we had that I think shows kind of the best of us. I'm definitely always grateful for the Nigerian community where it doesn't matter where you are. Like you meet a Nigerian, it's like, oh, you're Nigerian, you immediately strike a conversation. I was at a bowling alley like last week and I was talking to like the receptionist and this guy comes up to me and he's like, are you Nigerian? And I was like, how do you know? And he's like, it's the way you're speaking. And you know, it's like, you just meet people, Nigerians in the most random places, you know, and you kind of get those kind of interactions. So I'm always grateful for that. And I think the U.S., in terms of what I'm grateful for is, I mean, despite all the problems, there's still nowhere where you can find as much economic opportunity as the U.S. Like if you want to start a business, I don't know if it can get more easier anywhere else. The opportunities for growth here are just incredible. Like from a private citizen perspective, I think there's a lot of opportunity here that's just you're not going to meet anywhere else.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, man. That's pretty cool. And I see, like, when you were talking about what you were most grateful for Nigeria, I think the word that came to mind is we are resilient.
Resilient, exactly.
Yes, despite all of the different setbacks and things like that, we still have that positive spirit. I just wish we used it for more productive things sometimes. But I know it's a journey, and you don't make it happen in just one step. So we're kind of done with the podcast. We don't really have much of an audience yet. We're kind of building our audience, but usually this would be the forum where we'll give an opportunity to kind of hear whether it is a thought, whether it's something you're doing, whether it is something you're thinking about, whatever it is that you want to share to the audience. Just give you the floor for a few minutes to kind of share that information if you have any. And it's okay to say you don't have anything. That's fine as well.
I think one thing I'll just go back to that point I made earlier was about diaspora, is that there are a lot of successful Nigerians outside of Nigeria. So for me, I think in terms of like the economic opportunities and stuff that we have, there's no reason why we can't have like a Nigerian venture capitalist fund. Like there's so many different opportunities for us that I think we in diaspora have to start pulling our money economically. I think I don't know if it's Africa in general, or maybe Nigeria, but there's this sense of sort of like rugged individualism where it's like everyone is kind of focused on their individual success, which is great. But I think you can go further together than you can by yourself, right? Because you look at other communities like the Chinese community or the Jewish community, we need to start forming what I would call like a financial economic bloc, where now we have financial power, but now we slowly get political power. For me, I think that's the biggest transition we have to make in Nigerians is finding ways to relate our individual success to more of a group success. Like, I've always talked about, I would love a Nigerian mutual fund. I think like anything where we're pulling our money together and it's making us successful as a community, I think is definitely something we need to be looking at for the future. And I hope something that hopefully my generation is working on, right? I guess that's kind of my last thought.
Oh, thanks, brother. I never really thought about so I do understand the concept of what it says that we don't have this sense of community. That's incorrect. We have a sense of community. We don't collaborate very well together to actually do
economically
bigger projects, bigger economic projects together. That would be the right way to say it. So, and usually what happens, I think, this is my opinion, is that whenever there's money involved, the dynamic of the relationship changes significantly and doesn't become as productive as you would otherwise want. So thank you for really bringing that up, because that's something that we really need to pay attention to. There's no point in all of us being individually okay if we cannot collaborate and actually do bigger things to make even more people okay and more comfortable.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. I think in Nigerian culture, often finances is handled with a certain level of secrecy.
Yes.
And you get it from your parents, right? Because your parents never really tell you anything. So then you develop it. Yeah. But ultimately, you're going to have some sort of transparency if you want to work together with people financially. So I think that's our next step. That's
awesome, man. That's awesome. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. We went over time in true African fashion. You know, Africans will say we're doing this like, no, but over time, but it's been absolutely fantastic. Just wanted to appreciate you for coming on and the wisdom and perspective you were sharing on the podcast. That's absolutely fantastic as well. And I hope that you, me, and our audience actually take some of these things that we're talking about and actually think about it and have these conversations in our own individual spaces and see, okay, how do we actually come together, one collective, and actually make things happen, whether it is here, whether it is in other developed countries, and then how do we actually take that back to the continent to actually make things happen on the continent? Because some of the challenges that we talked about today are not just unique to Nigeria. I think some of them apply to other African countries as well. And if we can do this, if we can make these things happen, it will be positive on all sides.
No, I definitely agree. Thank you for having me on. It's definitely been a good experience. So hopefully I was able to give people some information that they can use to succeed either in the US or in Nigeria, honestly, as well. So, yeah, no, thank you.
I'm writing you this letter and letting you know that my brother, he go better, he done better. I'm writing you this letter and letting you know that my sister, he go better, he done better. Said it's gonna get better, my brother. Sister